Chapter 19 of The Recording Angel by Edwin Arnold Brenholtz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 19. Life is a disease of which sleep relieves us. It is but a palliative. Death is the remedy. Chamfort. The early dawn of the 23rd of February gave promise of one of those rare days scattered throughout the year which make us breathe deep, walk erect and with a light step, face the sun and floating fleecy white clouds and unfathomable depth of blue beyond with gladness, and which seem to shout to our willing senses, "Sorrow and death are past from the universe." To Robert, greeting the first rays of the life-giving sun from behind prison bars, it said not quite so much, but even to him it seemed the harbinger of hope, and he found himself again making plans for the future, plans vastly different from those of other days. He knew that Arndt would not be able to visit him as usual, owing to the great meeting at the mansion, so he tried to while away the hours by reading. But he soon found his mind wandering to what he supposed was taking place at the meeting. He was not so sanguine of a hearty acceptance of the plan as either Arndt or his father. He knew the men they had to deal with far better than they. Still, he was convinced that without the shares his father owned and controlled, Martinvale would be unable to reorganize the company and overthrow Craggie. From that his thoughts carried him forward to the day when he could again walk the earth a free man, and so perfectly in accord with such reflections was the present day that he stood for hours at the grated window, not letting his eyes look on man's work, but gazing straight and steadfastly at the sky and clouds, and unconsciously absorbing their quieting calm. 3 o'clock found him standing thus, and the insertion of the key and the opening of the door recalled him to his surroundings. He turned instantly and read on the faces of Arthur and Chandler that he was free. Bertram had been dismissed from the case about 3 weeks previous, owing to his having proposed to Robert to secure his release and final acquittal by means of purchased perjured testimony. Arthur said simply, "Come, let's go at once. I have wired Arndt to prepare your father. I got my man at last." Chandler wrung Robert's hand in silence, and then aided him to pack what he wished to take with him, leaving most of his books to be sent by express. They were out of the building and on their way to the station at 4. Some time was wasted while waiting for the next train. Just before it arrived, they noticed King's carriage drive up, and when he entered he came straight to them and said, "I congratulate you, Mr. Endy. I am on my way to visit your father." "He is not worse?" Robert demanded anxiously. "He found himself unable to personally address them. Arndt wired me, and as you know, I counseled against his having the meeting at all. I thought it better to go without being sent for this time." The train was one of those resultants of the capitalistic system of production and distribution which the rich inflict on the poor. Robert had tried to secure a special, but had been answered curtly that it was impossible. Their first glance at the engine and cars as they pulled into the station showed Robert that the outfit had been suited only to the scrap pile for years, but they could do no better and got aboard. They turned the back of one of the seats and faced each other, and then Robert said, "I suppose that there will be plenty of hot boxes on this wreck if we go over 10 miles an hour. Craggie should be made to ride in this himself for a day or two." He noticed a look of understanding pass between the others, and then he turned and said to Arthur, "You might as well while away the time by telling us of your search. Tell it from the beginning. It should be worth hearing." "Go on," said Chandler, as he saw Arthur hesitate. "King is one of us." "There is not much to tell until about a week ago," was the reply. "Then things began to come my way. All the other time seems to have been wasted, simply wasted, because we were all on the wrong trail, owing to the lack of the knowledge which Mr. Craggie would not disclose. I had followed Mr. Endy, as you all know, and soon had evidence enough to have set him free. But right there I lost myself as I have never before done. I followed trail after trail, only to every time land at the same spot. I had the wrong man again on the string when Mr. Craggie let me know that he wanted to see me. I had been wanting to have him talk to me in some other character than a suspect for some time, and therefore had given him an address where he could communicate with me. At the time I did so, he very emphatically informed me that I would never again do another bit of work for him or his friends, but I left my card just the same. And right then he, unwittingly, was the cause of my losing much time, for I told him plainly that the guilty party could not possibly be Mr. Endy's son, and I proved it to him. And then he said that he had reason to suspect a man in Pennsylvania, whose name and description he gave me. But if the grave has not already yawned for that man, I don't know what has become of him. And the telling me that did not help me a particle, for even now he refuses to tell the reasons for his suspicion. Well, it did not take me long to secure that interview. Fortunately, I was right there when the message arrived. I was at the car inside of an hour. It was at Clyde. I had a most interesting conversation with Mr. Craggie, which, as it was in my capacity as agent for Mr. Craggie, I cannot divulge. This much I can say. Chambers has been running a blackmailing scheme by means of some marvellously powerful and accurate talking machine, which he had concealed in the drawer of his desk. How long he has been taking down the president's private conversations, none of us know. His public ones, as we all are perfectly aware, haven't much in them, and he, knowing full well that the secretary's uncorroborated word could never harm him, has been turning himself loose from time to time. He admitted as much. It was that machine that threw every one of us off the track. I have never seen it, and we don't know where it is, but it must be nearly perfection, for it took down what was said while it was inside a closed drawer and while the train was in motion, though that last doesn't count for much, as the president's car moves along so smoothly that there is scarcely jolt or jar, not like this one. There seemed to be no clue to how Chambers had done his work, other than his own explanation, which was false in every particular, until a chance word of Mr. C. put me on the track. Then everything was clear as daylight. Then I had the secretary taken on a little trip up the country, and I investigated the car. I did not find the machine, but I found another bottom for the drawer, one without any holes or spring, and something else. I thought, then, that Chambers had, like is usual with most criminals, carelessly left his trail open, but I'm not so sure about that now. Well, the next step was to go to the hotel, where Chambers had spent that night. There I found that there were at least 2 persons who would swear that a conversation had been carried on in Chambers' room during a great part of the night of the attack on Mr. Endy. One of them I had previously talked to, and it was only because I did not then know what Mr. Craggie had to tell that I lost the trail. I found that it was easy enough for a man to have entered and left the hotel any number of times that night without being seen. You remember it snowed, and few people are on the streets of Steelton after midnight. But I had still only proved Mr. Craggie's case. I had not helped ours a particle. I could find no proof that Chambers had left the hotel, although I was by this time certain that he had gone out, for the tale told by Mr. Craggie showed that he had a motive sufficient to make him do so. It was at this point that I again came to a complete standstill, and as usual at such times, I just walked up and down and waited for something to turn up, or for some new thought on the subject. I sauntered into the station at Steelton, and the lieutenant of police who arrested John Smith of Nowhere, as they still call him, said that Smith's sentence for the rioting would soon be served, and asked whether Arndt intended to prosecute on the other charge. I told him that he would, so far as I knew. Then the officer said that in that case Smith would get a chance to take a trip to the place he calls Nowhere, and that pretty soon. He explained that he had heard from Clyde, where Smith is in the county prison, that he seems to be dying, as some of them do, simply because they can't get used to being housed up. Right there I had another thought like the one I had in the car, and I boarded the next train and visited Mr. Smith. The smell of spring is already in the air, and he is needing freedom pretty badly. So when I stated my case, which was that if he would tell who it was that ran away from the Endy house on that night, and prove what he said, I would guarantee his not being prosecuted by Arndt. I felt perfectly justified in making that promise, although there was no time to consult with anyone. You see, we really had scarcely enough evidence to hold him on. In fact, we could not have done it if that had been the only charge, for he has insisted from the first that what he really said was he, not I, and he put up a plausible enough tale about his knowledge of the affair by saying that he had been told all about it after the occurrence by a pal of his, whom he would not go back on. Consequently, he has kept on asserting that he would prove an alibi when the time came. Now, it appears that Chambers called at the prison on 2 occasions to see this fellow, and in his last talk with me Smith again asserted the same, and refused to admit a thing or take advantage of my offer. He added, "I don't mind saying that I can prove by the testimony of Mr. Chambers, Mr. Craggy's secretary, that I was in his room at the hotel, talking to him at the very time you say I was making an attack on Arndt. In fact, I was there almost all night." I just laughed when I heard that and said, "Yes, and when Chambers, who has been very kind to you in other ways, adds to his kindness by perjuring himself for you, and when you swear to the same thing, he will have you where you cannot help shouldering the part of principal in a neat little blackmailing villainy of his, by which he extorted $800,000 from President Craggy. How much of that money did you get?" When he saw through that, he was hot, I can assure you, and I then said, "Did you ever tell him that you had followed him to his room?" "Do I want to be put out of the way?" he asked. "Never said a word like that to anybody yet, but if you'll guarantee what you said, I'll tell all I know." So I took down his testimony and had him swear to it. And it turns out that he followed the man who ran from the house, the soft snow underfoot and the falling flakes making it perfectly easy to follow very close without fear of detection. And that, although the man led him hither and yon for almost an hour, he never lost sight of him until he passed into the room which he said Mr. Craggy occupied. I told him that that would never do, since Chambers himself would corroborate Mr. Craggy in denying that. But he insisted that he had heard Mr. Craggy speaking when the man opened the door and went in, and that he knew the president's voice well enough to never forget it. He hates Craggy more violently than I thought a human being could hate anyone. He cannot utter his name without cursing, though in all his other talk he scarcely uses an oath. He says he was formerly an employee of Craggy's, and that because he was not deferential enough on one occasion, the president discharged him and blacklisted him, reducing him to poverty and his present condition. Of course, I know nothing about the truth or falsity of this." "I can well believe every word of it," Robert asserted. "Be that as it may, I must ask your indulgence for a moment, for I feel ashamed of the lack of success in this case. But when a man has to deal with 2 rascals who are good in spots, and who yet do not mind lying or even perjuring themselves. That person who is trying to catch up with them has a hard row to hoe. In the very outset it occurred to me that this man might have followed the other one, but even there I was on a false scent, for I thought the fact was that they were confederates, and that the reason Smith persisted in his knowing nothing was because he was standing true to a pal. During my investigation, I found out that Chambers had been kind to this man at different times, and then it occurred to me that it might be friendship for the secretary that was influencing him, and it was only after my assuring him that the evidence against Chambers was already enough to convict him of the blackmailing that Smith consented to speak at all. If people were bad all through or good all through, we could get at them easier. Now, at the rate we are traveling, there will be plenty of time to tell you everything, but if you wish me to cut it short, I will do so. "By no means," said King. "We are completely at the mercy of one of the tentacles of the octopus. We will arrive at Steelton about sunset, provided we don't break down completely, simply because of the through express. This local will have to be on the side track at that place, I understand, in order to let the through express pass. Otherwise, I should not be sure of arriving there tonight." Arthur laughed, for he saw that King was becoming irritated at their delay at every little station, and he said, "Never travelled to Steelton on the local before, Doctor?" "Never, sir, and never shall again." "Poor people have to put up with it all the time," said Chandler sententiously. "But go on with your story, Mr. Arthur." "Well, you can see that Smith had a motive both times for trying to kill Arndt. He says that any working man who will shoot to kill even the lowest hoodlum, or will order others to do so, is a traitor to his own class, since most of the criminal element have been or are the victims of the rich. He has it all worked out in his own mind on the anarchist theory, and you ought to hear him curse the socialists. He hates them just a little less than he does Craggy. Now, his testimony in regard to hearing Craggy speaking in the secretary's room fits in so exactly with the talking machine business that I saw at once how we had all been fooled simply by Chambers being smart enough to wind that machine before he started out to attack Mr. Endy. I say wind, but in fact I suspect that there is some motor attached to the affair to make it run so long as it does. As for the motive for the attack, it was to fasten the guilt upon Mr. Craggy. But in order to explain that to you, I would have to tell you what Mr. Craggy told me in confidence. You can just take my word for it that if Mr. Robert had not been set upon by the detectives, Chambers would have had the president behind the bars on the same charge, provided that was what he wished. What he really was after I don't pretend to know. Mr. Craggy himself is obliged to admit that there are many reasons to cause one to conclude that it was not money. This much is sure, he could not foresee that Mr. Robert was going to be implicated at all. He only intended to get his chief completely in his power. Afterwards, it was impossible for him to help the way things were going without relaxing his hold on Mr. Craggy. So far as I now know, he intended to let Mr. Robert suffer for the crime unless he could control Mr. Craggy otherwise, but he insisted not. He expressed great pleasure at being able to bear witness to your innocence, sir." Robert's thoughts were evidently far away, and he made no reply, so Arthur turned to the others and continued, "I swore out a warrant for the arrest of Chambers. No, I swore out only one. Mr. Craggy will never prosecute on his charge for various reasons. I knew that the two men had again taken to the car, for Mr. Craggy kept me informed of his movements and intentions. He had also taken the cook on board, since he knew that the whole yarn about the conversations leaking out through there was a lie. It was about 10:30 this morning when I boarded the car at the pipe mills 50 miles beyond Clyde. I waited in the cook's room until we were spinning along at a clipping rate, and I had to hold a revolver at the cook's head to keep him from giving warning. As soon as I felt that it would be impossible for Chambers to jump from the train, for I could not look for much help from Craggy, I stepped out. When I opened the door, I expected to have to make a rush for Chambers, and would not have been a particle surprised to have heard the hum of bullets coming my way, for I was obliged to go in facing him. But as soon as he caught sight of me, he arose quietly and said, "How do you do, Mr. Arthur? I am very glad to see you. There is no need to state your errand. I was really becoming anxious, lest even the smartest detective in the United States, or perhaps in the world, was not going to be able to pick up any of the clues I have been throwing about all over the country." Here he held out his hand, and he is such a gentlemanly fellow that before I knew it I found myself shaking hands with him, and that made Craggy mad, and he began to taunt him and sneer at him. I brought that to a close, for Chambers turned to me and smilingly said, "Don't you usually protect your prisoners, Mr. Arthur? Don't you know that words are sharper than knives?" "Gods!" cried Craggy, "I wish you had remembered that before." "I have never forgotten it for a moment during the last 4 months, Mr. President, and very infrequently during the preceding 15 years," said he coolly. "That man is a jewel of a knave. What a pity that we live under a system that perverts such abilities as he and men like him possess," said King meditatively. Arthur continued, "True. If we could have made an honest man out of him, I would have been thankful to have taken him into partnership. The two of us could have run down any road that ever lived, I believe." And then after a pause he said, "I shall never forget that ride. He asked to see the warrant, and when he noted that it was not for the blackmailing affair, he laughed until I thought he would never stop." "Well, well, you are certainly a clever detective, but I don't think much of the courage of Mr. Craggy. Why is not the other charge pressed, Mr. President? Of course you could not get the money again, for it is spent, but I should have thought that you would like to have your revenge. You know that Mr. Endy did not die, and I can be prosecuted only for assault with intent to murder, and a clever lawyer such as I will be certain to retain will make it only burglary. Mr. Endy recollects nothing, and you have never found the instrument with which he was struck." And then he proceeded to badger Mr. Craggy in a style that I could have enjoyed had he been any other man's prisoner. So I told him that what was sauce for the goose, and so forth. He smiled as he paid me another compliment, and said, "How do you propose to make me stop, Mr. Arthur? Do you contemplate gagging me?" "I propose to ask you as a personal favor to not make this ride any more uncomfortable than is absolutely necessary," said I. "You are a gentleman, sir, and I take pleasure in conversing with you." And he turned his back on Mr. Craggy, and such a talk as I listened to for the rest of the journey it has never before been my privilege to enjoy. He had men, women, literature, and art at his tongue's end, and a golden tongue it was. At last he glanced out of the window and said, "Yes, we are nearing Clyde, and I will have to deny myself the pleasure of further conversation at present, and the place to which I am going is not supposed to be very attractive to visitors." "I shall take pleasure in coming to see you," said I. "How in the world did you ever find time to keep so well up with things?" "Don't make rash promises. Remember with what I stand charged. I thank you for your courteous offer, but I could not wish to see you there, even as a visitor. As to your question, a man that remembers whatever he hears and whatever his eye once rests upon, be it animate or inanimate, soon acquires a stock of information in spite of himself. I had a remarkable memory even as a child, and I have strengthened it for a purpose that knows no yielding until nothing escapes me. Let me show you." And he reached to the table and picked at random, out of a pile of unopened mail, a book, which he hastily unpacked, and he then read the first 3 pages rapidly. Then he handed it to me, saying, "Test me, please. On my word of honor as a gentleman, it is the first time I ever saw a word of it." And, gentlemen, he repeated those 3 pages verbatim. "How do you ever do it?" I exclaimed. "Oh, that one was particularly easy because I am interested in political economy. You would testify as to my ability to remember and repeat accurately, would you not, Mr. Arthur?" "I certainly would," said I, "and with pleasure if you needed it." "Thank you, sir. But then, really, you have no idea of what I can do when I put myself to it, for those subjects on which we conversed have been the recreation of a very busy and not altogether useless life." "Worse than useless," interposed Mr. Craggie. Chambers paid no more attention to him than if he had not spoken. Turning to me from looking out of the window, he said, "I believe that I will light a cigar. These," as he opened his cigar case, "are the brand I like best, but Mr. Craggie objects to them, so, on second thought, I will fill the other side of the case from his box to remember him by, and will smoke one of them so as not to disoblige him at the last." Clyde was near at hand. We were running in very slowly, being in the rear of the local, and the president pushed the box towards me, saying, "Help yourself, Mr. Arthur." I accepted and lit a cigar, and Chambers lit his from mine, and then said very seriously, "Really, I would not advise you to gamble with fate as I do, for though life is a disease of which sleep relieves us, it is but a palliative. Death is the remedy, as Chamfort says." "What do you mean?" said I. "Simply that Mr. Craggie has not enjoyed my society lately, and I have been gratifying my love of gambling by smoking his cigars." "Gambling?" said I. "Neither more nor less," he replied seriously. "Chandler remarked just the other day that I was getting very thin and even more pale than usual, and it is all through anxiety as to whether any of those cigars will eventually permanently disagree with me." He was smoking very rapidly and did not even take the cigar from between his lips when he said, "I wish to thank you, Mr. Arthur, for the kindly way in which you have made pleasant a most trying episode. There is the depot of Clyde in sight. It is a beautiful country, this. I want you to take notice that I acknowledge my guilt on both charges, though you prefer only one. On further consideration, I have decided to cheat the lawyers out of a fat fee. I shall make no defense." "Be careful," said I. "Whatever you say I shall have to use against you." He continued to smoke very fast and paid no attention to my warning. "I have had an exceedingly pleasant time the last 3 months and more in Mr. Craggie's society. I've been a sort of big fish myself, you know, and I've enjoyed that almost as much as my friend, the president, does." Turning to him, he said, "Sir, I hand you a communication which you will find of the utmost interest." And as Mr. Craggie took it from his hand, he said, "Goodbye, sir. I shall be pleased to see you whither I am going." Mr. Craggie immediately tore open the envelope, and Chambers turned to me, and after an instant's pause, said, "Here is my confession in writing. You may need it to set young Endy free at once. Tell him that I would never have seen him actually convicted of the crime, even though I did spirit his witnesses out of his reach. I have carried that confession about with me ever since the day of his arrest. I am truly thankful that Mr. Endy did not—" He stopped. The cigar fell from his lips, and as Mr. Craggie dropped the paper he was still holding unread while he listened, he, Craggie, almost screamed, "Poisoned, by Jove!" and Chambers fell forward. I caught him and laid him on the floor of the car. He was dead. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Recording Angel by Edwin Arnold Brenholtz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 20. Great Caesar fell. Oh, what a fall was there, my countrymen! Shakespeare. The exclamation of horror which sprang from the lips of Robert Endy caused the detective to pause in his narrative, and he wiped his face vigorously, the while remarking that the car was very warm. It was a fact, but it was mostly his eyes that he wiped. Robert's thoughts had been so completely with his father that although he heard the detective's words, their meaning did not make a very clear impression on his brain, and the last statements had therefore taken him somewhat by surprise. He could see that to King and Chandler the death of Chambers was no news. After a moment he said, "And so he has paid the penalty of his crime. My friends, I thank you that you did not mar the joy of the moment of my deliverance with such news. Well, well, and so it was Chambers! Now I think of it, he had black hair, but I never once suspected him." "Yes," said Arthur, "and it matches the sample a great deal better than Mr. Endy's does, but still it doesn't match. I tell you, there is black hair and black hair. I had just come from an interview with you when I first saw those hairs, and I never even took the trouble to make any closer comparison than that. But don't think that I did not examine Chambers' hair months ago. It will be after today when we get to the bottom of the hair business." "He had on a wig," said Chandler positively. Arthur smiled as he said emphatically, "Wrong again. Just as I was. The hair was fresh and not dead, and had been pulled out by the roots. It was a long time before I could get any of Mr. Craggie's hair to examine, but when I did, I would immediately have had him arrested as the guilty party, had I not previously found out certain things that make it physically impossible for it to have been him. On that night, snow fell from shortly after 12 until nearly 3. There were no footmarks towards the door in the snow on the car platform or steps, nor about the car the next morning. There were some coming out. They were a woman's. I have the measure of them." "And yet, you say, why, how in the world?" said King. "I don't know," said Arthur, "but I'm going to keep on trying until I find out. And there are some more things in this case that I don't yet know. I must find out what became of our witnesses." Robert had become interested, and King was glad to notice it, and said, "Hurry, Mr. Arthur. At least tell us all that you know." "Well, the first thing I did was to throw the nearest window wide open. Then I stooped to pick up the remainder of the cigar. And as I did so, I noticed the paper Mr. Craggie had not yet unfolded lying there close by the cigar, and I picked both of them up and handed the paper to Mr. Craggie, and carefully placed the cigar in the case, which I drew from the dead man's pocket." "No, he had not substituted one of his cigars. His are short, thick, very black ones, and that side of the case is still full, and the only vacant space in the case, when I opened it, was just where I had seen him place a cigar from Craggie's box, and then, on second thought, take it out again, light and smoke it. His words kept ringing in my ears until, in spite of myself, I threw the remainder of my cigar out of the window. As I did this, Mr. Craggie, who had been standing as though rooted to the spot, seemed to come to himself, and he replaced the paper in the envelope which he still held, and put them in his pocket. Then he said sharply, "What did you do that for?" "Couldn't help it," said I. "Chambers was smoking one of yours when he died." "Why, you certainly are not fool enough to believe that man's crazy talk. Why, he poisoned himself to escape hanging." Mr. Craggie stopped right there. In fact, the last syllable was only a gurgle in his throat, and then he cried out, "Great God! And his life was not even in danger!" I had been watching his face closely, and I then said, "Now, I think that you are an innocent man, this time, but I'll tell you candidly that innocence don't always save a man, as you ought to know. If you will look back over the past 4 months, you will see that things look black for you. If Chambers had been expressing fears for his life to people in general, as he did to me, and if there are others who know that you had a reason for getting rid of him and his testimony, I am going to have a hard time clearing you. My advice to you is to say absolutely nothing until I or your counsel give you the word." And then I examined the other pockets in Chambers' clothing, and in one of them I found a certain power of attorney, whose wording showed at once that others held just that information. And when I showed this to Mr. Craggie, well, gentlemen, I have no words to describe the effect on that proud and overbearing man.
He pleaded with me to save him. He promised half his wealth. He kept repeating over and over again, my God, why was he so bitter towards me? I always treated him as well as I did anybody." At last I said, "If we knew his motive, we would probably solve the whole affair. You rich men don't seem to realize that the way you are carrying on is liable to—" But right there I came to a stop. The car had been shifted to the siding where it usually stands, and we had been so taken up with our own affairs that we had not noticed the black cook when he leaped from it before it came to a standstill. As soon as he touched the ground, he cried to the conductor and engineer, "Good God, man! Mr. Chambers has been murdered by that old devil in there!" All of these men were attached to Chambers, and when we realized what was going on, we were brought to our senses with a jar, for the train was surrounded by a howling mob crying, "Lynch Craggy!" and so forth. I had scarcely time to push him into the cook's room, which was the only place that could be defended, when, as I faced about with a gun in each hand, I found that the conductor and engineer were coming into the car. I had no time to lock the door. When they saw Chambers lying there, the tears rolled down their faces, and they cried to those outside, "It is true! He's dead!" And I do not wonder that Mr. Craggy cowered into the remotest corner when he heard the screams and execrations of the crowd. I have faced mobs before, but may God Almighty save me from ever confronting such another one. There was not a hoodlum or a tramp in that crowd. It was largely made up of the passengers who had been waiting for the next train and the railroad employees. After gazing at Chambers for several minutes, the men turned to search for the president. Rocks and some bullets had smashed every window in the car. Mr. Craggy had been hit more than once by the rocks, but at that point the man who used to be telegraph operator at Steelton, Fred Paisley by name, sprang onto the car steps with a rope in his hand already looped and knotted, and cried, "Stop that firing! You might kill him! Bullets are too good for Craggy. Here's the rope to finish him." They stopped to listen to him, and he said, "I used to hate Chambers, thought he caused me to lose my job and had me blacklisted. I found out the other day who it was that has been keeping me and my family from want. It was Archibald Chambers. Death to the man that killed him." I began to think that my own time was getting pretty close, for I don't usually abandon an employer. The conductor and engineer saw me standing there as soon as they turned. At the same instant, I called to them to throw up their hands, and said I would shoot the first man that came towards me. I tried to argue with them. I told them that Mr. Craggy was my prisoner, and that I proposed to hand him over to the authorities. Nothing did a bit of good. I suppose there would have been but one termination to the affair, if someone at the station had not telephoned for Jones, and while I was still arguing he came on the scene. I don't know how Jones does it. He didn't have a single deputy with him. He didn't apply to the governor for troops, but the fact remains that he made his way through the crowd to my side and had the engineer and conductor deputized and persuaded to help us keep the peace in a few minutes. The man is absolutely fearless for one thing, but I think that I am not much of a coward, and I could do nothing. Of course, it wasn't pleasant for Mr. Craggy to face the crowd, but it had to be done, and I'm free to confess that they hustled him about considerable before we reached the prison van, which was drawn up as close to the car as the mob would let it come. That was the only time that Jones drew his gun, but when he did, he used it. Just as he was pushing Craggy up the steps of the van, the ex-operator, Paisley, who still held the rope, slipped up and dexterously threw it over the prisoner's head. He pulled vigorously on it and cried to the others, "Catch hold, boys! We'll have him in spite of Jones! Jones has sold out to the millionaires!" That word was his last, and the rope was off of Mr. Craggy before he took another step. The sight of the dead man cooled the courage of the mob, and we drove off at full speed. Then the prisoner was soon behind bars and stood committed for trial. for the magistrate refused him bail when he learned that Chandler and the engineer and the cook and the conductor, to say nothing of myself, all had heard the dead man express fears for his safety. And when I was obliged to say that Chambers had told me of those fears in the presence of the prisoner not 5 minutes previous to his death, and that the cigar, which I suppose was the direct cause of his death, had been, to my certain knowledge, taken out of Mr. Craggie's box, the magistrate, who usually knows which way the popular wind is blowing, would not listen to my supposition that Chambers himself had placed it there. For that's the way I interpret Chambers' talk about gambling, but said, "That will do, gentlemen. This court does not need any more testimony. Committed without bail." "That's the end of Jones's popularity, mark my words," said Chandler. "Watch for the reaction against socialism," said Arthur. The train at this moment pulled up at a station 20 miles from Steelton, and the usual tinkering with hot boxes commenced. The 4 men were nearly wild with impatience. Arthur left the car and went into the telegraph office and wired to Arndt, and in a few moments Arndt replied, "My God, man, are you that far away yet? Thought you were coming on a special. Carriage is waiting at the depot for you now. Hurry, I tell you, hurry." Arthur did not show the telegram. He went to the engineer, an old acquaintance of his, and said, "Introduce me to that conductor of yours, will you? There is $1,000 in it for you and him if you will drop those 2 cranky coaches on the siding, put all the passengers in ours, which hasn't had but 4 men in it the whole trip, and land us in Steelton just as fast as this engine can get there." Seeing that the man was wavering, Arthur added, "You don't need any orders from headquarters. All you have to do is to try to make up some of that lost time. You are now way behind the schedule, you know." The engineer hesitated and finally said, "Sorry, I can't oblige you, but you know the rules. Much as a man's job is worth to think for himself and use ordinary good judgment these days. So far as a clear track, you're right enough, for we are on number 4, formerly for freight, not much freight from Steelton these days, and they've put us over here to be out of the way of the through express. No, it isn't right of way that is the matter, but it's the dropping of those coaches, you see. Blacklist is a pretty tough proposition, you know." Arthur replied by handing him the telegram, at the same time saying, "Mr. Endy's son is in that car, going home to his father." Come along," said the engineer, starting toward the conductor. "I thought the old gent was all right again." Arthur said, "So we all thought. Something must have gone wrong today." After a few moments' conference, the conductor said, "If all of you gentlemen will agree to bear me out in my statement as to the dangerous condition of those forward coaches, I will drop them. I am much obliged for your offer, Mr. Arthur, but I don't want a penny in such a case. If we get fired, it will be in a good cause." So they went to the others and stated the case, and in a few moments they were traveling at a fairly satisfactory rate of speed toward Steelton. While the change was being made, Arthur wired Arndt, "Could not get a special. 20 miles away. Are coming on with but 1 coach. May be with you in 30 minutes." All the party were much cheered when they felt the swift onward movement of the train. Even this car was not filled, for everybody seemed to be going toward Clyde. The trains that sped by them on the regular passenger track were all crowded, and from the number of them that went by, it could easily be seen that extras were being run. Arthur had noticed this, but Robert now did for the first time, and he said, "So Mr. Craggie is having a chance to find out how an innocent man feels in prison, for I presume that he is innocent, but it may be that he will be very glad that the walls are thick and that Jones has him in charge before morning. Did you notice how crowded that last car was that passed us now?" Arthur replied, "Yes, and so were all the others, and so was every train that has passed us this afternoon. As to his innocence, I thought so and I hope so. But Chandler told me some things that are troubling me mightily. As to the moral guilt, I think, from what I have learned since this strike commenced, that he is many times a murderer. I am going back tomorrow to consult with him, and An exclamation burst from King. "Didn't you know it? I thought you were concealing it from Endy. Mr. Craggie is dead." Each looked at the others in speechless amazement, and finally King resumed. "I was just stepping into my carriage, intending to catch the 2:30 express for Steelton, when I was called to the magistrate's office to attend a dying man. What they sent for me for I don't know, for he had shot himself in the mouth and blown the top of his head most off. Why will people kill themselves in such horrible ways? There was not a thing for anybody to do. So when I got there, knowing that I had missed the express, I asked for particulars. You must have started from there as soon as he gave his corroborating testimony in regard to Chambers' confession of Endy's innocence." "Yes," said both Arthur and Chandler, and the latter added, "We had to go through with the red tape business necessary to liberate a falsely imprisoned and perfectly innocent man, you know." "Miserable farce," said King. "That's my opinion of the law, as we have it today. Well, as soon as he was committed for trial, and while waiting for the prison van to arrive or something else, he took from his pocket a letter addressed to him by Chambers. He laid the envelope on the desk in front of him, read the letter, and then slowly tore it into minute fragments and dropped wad after wad of them into the reeking cuspidor, into which the policeman who had him in charge was expectorating mouthful after mouthful of tobacco juice. He seemed to be so unconcerned that no one thought to stop him, and he smiled every time a lot of the pieces were engulfed in the filth. Almost everybody had drawn away from him, and when the last of the letter had disappeared from sight, he requested the officer to get him some water to drink. The man was not 10 feet away from him before Mr. Craggie was dead. "In God's name," said Arthur, "what could have been on that paper? Mr. Craggie said to me while we were standing over the body of Chambers, 'I wonder why he was so bitter towards me,' and my guess is that he had found out." "The country is well rid of both of them, I think," said Chandler. "Not much choice between Mr. Craggie and Martinvale or some of the others who are likely to succeed them in running things," said Robert. "But here we are at Steelton." And without waiting for the train to stop completely, Robert sprang from the car and grasped old Rollins by the hand with the single word "Father" on his lips, and Rollins, not knowing of his ignorance, said bluntly, "Still alive, sir, but sinking fast." Arthur was by this time at Robert's side and supported him when he staggered under the blow. In another moment Robert had regained control of himself and sprang on the back of Arndt's pet, which he had recognized as he left the car, and then the mud of Steelton streets was sent to right and left under the rhythmic blows of willing, speeding feet, and Robert was out of sight before his companions could enter the carriage which stood waiting for them. In Clyde there was neither mud nor sleet. In Steelton the depth of the mixture made traveling slow. When they were fairly started, Arthur said, "Man proposes. I worked like a beaver to get Chambers arrested in time to let Robert get home on the day of the meeting, for his father assured me that it would lack only that of being the proudest and happiest day of his life. He had not a doubt of his plan being accepted." "Do not upbraid yourself," said King. "Had you anything to do with the guilt of any of the others? Suppose that Robert were still in prison. My idea is that if his father is as low as that, he would now be dead were it not for the sustaining hope you gave him of seeing his son again. And great and small and high and low are instruments of his." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Recording Angel by Edwin Arnold Brenholtz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 21. For some days must be dark and dreary. Longfellow. On this same day, as Arndt turned to hasten to Mr. Endy's room, he confronted Kenedy, who had been admitted at the side door.
He immediately showed him the telegram from Arthur, and his face was very pleasant to look at, for the joy on it was genuine, as he said, "I tell you, Doc, this arrives in the nick of time. Mr. Endy took the acceptance of his plan much harder than I feared he would its rejection. I think he had braced himself for its rejection, but when in his conversation before dinner with Martinvale and others, he found that the pension plan which, on account of its liberality, was what he feared would be the great stumbling block, was not strenuously objected to, he took heart and talked enthusiastically of the future, and a great deal too much. I warned and warned him, but you know his favourite saying, 'A man's immortal till his work is done.' And once he added playfully, 'And don't you know, my boy, I've got a lifetime of work ahead to put this plan in successful operation.' I had not the heart to tell him that several of them had said plainly to me, supposing that I was no longer a working man, for it has been told everywhere recently that I am soon to marry a rich woman, that there would be no difficulty in keeping the amount paid out under the pension section very small, simply by discharging the men on one pretext or another before they became eligible under the time limit. I tell you, Doc, I was converted to socialism right at the moment when Martinvale himself had the audacity to tell me that. He is shrewd. He supposed that I would hear it being talked sooner or later, and so he closed my mouth by telling it to me himself. Of course now I cannot repeat it in public. And if you could have heard the way they figured and cut on each proposition that would make it easier for a working man to accumulate anything, I think that I would not have much trouble in converting you either." They were by this time standing outside of Mr. Endy's door, and could hear Nettie and Annie talking to him, and Kennedy said bluntly, "You'll never do it, Charlie, never in this world. Your sister completed the work long ago." And then he held out his hand and said cordially, "Shake, comrade." Mr. Endy heard their voices and called eagerly, "Charles, Charles, come quickly. I need you at once." Kennedy, as soon as he heard that voice, knew that a great change had occurred, and he whispered to Arndt as he returned the telegram, "Not till I give you the word." As soon as they entered, Mr. Endy called out, "Come, come, my dear boy, I must have a new will drawn up at once. The strike is about over, and what is left of the estate must be willed to Robert unconditionally. I must give him that last proof that I trust him fully. Get me pen, ink, and paper. I will write it myself. It doesn't take many words to give all of a person, or all of an estate, or all of heaven or hell." While he was speaking, they had passed to where they could see his face, and the way in which it had aged, and the way in which the light of hope had died out of it, brought tears to their eyes, and Arndt was glad of the excuse to leave the room and go into the study for what was wanted. Kennedy immediately commenced to talk cheerfully of the future, and how glad he was to learn that the plan was to be put in operation, and while he talked he prepared some restorative, and then asked Mr. Endy to take it. "What's the use, Doctor? Don't I know that my work is done, that the plan will be used to further the interests of the rich, will be used to defer the day of final payment, will be used to put new shackles on the worker? No, no, I have prayed, when I can no longer be instrumental in averting strife between the rich and poor, do not let me live to see the inevitable struggle." Martinvale said plainly that he and the others would never submit to the will of the voters if it took the shape of socialism. The workers have submitted year after year and century after century to legislation adverse to their interests, and have done it with little murmuring. They are the patriots, the men I entertain to this day, and all like them are the traitors. Again Kennedy begged him to take the medicine, and again he refused, saying, "I have strength enough left to make that will, and write some farewell words to my son. That is enough. I do not care to live beyond the last gleam of that shining sun." Arndt had returned while he was speaking, and Kennedy looked meaningly at him. Arndt simply placed the open telegram in the father's hand.
Nettie was seated by his side, and Annie stood with her hand resting on the pillow close by his head, and when he took in the meaning of the joyful news, he closed his eyes in silent thanksgiving for quite a while, and at last said, "Give me your medicine, doctor, whatever you will. My boy is free, is coming home. I must be here to welcome him." Nettie leaned over and kissed him, saying, "Father, don't forget that I have no one to lean on but you. You must stay with me for many, many years." It was the first time she had given him that endearing title, and he clasped her hand tightly and said, "Dear child, I would to God that I could for your sake, but I must go, and you will not need me," looking significantly at Arndt. But both of them knew that things were not as they had been between Arndt and the girl, not since the day of her arrival at the mansion. Arndt placed the paper on the invalid's table and pushed it to the bedside, and then Mr. Endy wrote the necessary words in a surprisingly steady hand and said, "Friends, I acknowledge that to be my last will and testament, and request all to sign as witness of my acknowledgment, and that I am of sound and disposing mind." In the meantime Arndt had sent for a notary before he returned to the room with the pen and paper, and while they were signing that official arrived and took the acknowledgment of all in legal form. When everything was finished, Mr. Endy leaned back and rested for a time, and Arndt accompanied the notary to the door, and upon his return to the bedside his friend spoke to him, and all could note that his voice was plainly weaker, saying, "Charles, how soon do you think they can be here?" "I hope within an hour, sir, if they got a special and started when the telegram was sent." Once more he took the remedy and rested, and when he looked at them again it was much more brightly, and he said, "See here, doctor, I don't want to go to sleep. I have much to say to Robert, and many things may happen to delay him. I will talk. Charles, get ready and take down my words, my final words to Robert. I feel that there should be little left to say when he arrives." Kennedy replied promptly, "It will do you no harm to talk, but you should not give up. There is no need for you to die, if you will only think so, and use your utmost endeavours to survive the shock you have sustained. I know how severe a one it is, and Mr. Martinville should be hanged, but you can still do much for humanity." "Doctor," said he, "I have done with fooling myself. I am wedded to that plan of mine. If they had rejected it, I would still have worked to secure for it a chance. And even now, convinced as I am that the 10 years' work was wasted, I could not refrain, if I survived, from seeking to put this and the other feature of it in operation. I would be a hindrance to the young men who have quite another work to do, and it is because I so fully realize this weakness of mine that I know my work is done. All I ask of you is, abide with me till night shall come, and keep me here and in condition to welcome my boy, and if I might so far presume on our years of acquaintance, stand shoulder to shoulder with the workers in the future. You are a laboring man as well as they. Their highest interests are yours." "You mean the Socialists? I am already enlisted. So is Arndt. Let me greet you, my comrade." "That is good, that is good. Oh, what a word that is! That is the word I have missed all my life. At the last I have learned to say and love it." Turning to Annie Arndt, he said, "Dear girl, let me thank you for the untiring kindness with which you tried to show me this. But you know we can learn our lesson in but one way, you in yours, I in mine. I am thankful that it was so gentle a hand that snapped my chains and set me free." Annie leaned over and kissed his forehead and said, "Comrade, I will never forget those words of thanks. They shall nerve me for the days to come." Arndt said that he was ready, and Mr. Endy requested the others not to leave, as he had nothing to say that all might not hear, and then, sentence by sentence, slowly, slower
and slower, and ever more feebly, he spoke as the hours dragged interminably along. Ever the pauses between the sentences became longer. At times they thought that he would never speak again. But when Arthur's message was read, setting a definite moment for the arrival of his son, he seemed to revive wonderfully, and hurried through what he had still to say. Arndt alone knew that he had sent Jeanette to the station for Robert. He could not be there to greet him. He sent his best instead, and Robert read the loving thought and blessed him for it. Arndt knew the thud, thud, thud of those faithful feet as far as they could be heard, and as soon as Robert left the muddy highway and entered the mansion grounds, the tidings of his coming was borne to Arndt's ears, and he whispered to Kennedy, "He's coming! He's here!" The ears of death are sharp. Mr. Endy caught each word, and when Robert, finding no one to meet or restrain him, supposing that his father was dead, rushed into the room, he found the old man standing with open arms to greet him and crying, "Praise the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Praise his holy name, for this my son was lost and is found, was dead and is alive." For the moment, Robert was so shocked, so overjoyed, that he did not take another step. And then his father said, but oh, how weak and trembling the voice had become, "I bid you welcome home, my boy. All I have is yours. All these are comrades mine, and all are pledged for life. Are you one of us? Can you yet speak the comrade word?" Now, the only reservation in Robert's mind, when he wrote to his father the last time, was the fact of his conversion to Socialism. Annie Arndt had sent him book after book and paper after paper, and finally several letters on the subject, and so it was with great relief and joy that he was able to squarely meet his father's look and say, "With all my heart I can. All that I have or am is for the cause. God bless the comrade cause." "My work is done," his father said, and would have fallen if Robert had not clasped him to his heart. Then Kennedy and Arndt, who noticed how nerveless hung the hands of their friend, went to Robert's assistance, and when they laid his father down they saw that that which we call life and thought had gone away side by side. Annie and Nettie could not restrain their tears. They went into the study adjoining the bedroom, and to the window that opened out onto his much-loved balcony, and when Arndt saw them there he also came and stood beside them and noticed that the last rays of the sun, that sun that had shone so brightly, warmly, cheeringly through all this awful day, was gilding the western sky more gloriously than he had seen before. The room behind him was filled with the tender light, and he now remembered that throughout the day the birds had been singing and twittering their delight at what they thought was spring at hand. And as he stooped to kiss his sister, he said, "And yet the spring, the day of birth, is far away. There's much of winter yet to face and bear." At that kiss Nettie turned away and glanced through the open doorway behind them, and as she did so she saw the agony on the face of Robert Endy, who had thrown himself on his knees and was gazing at his father's face as one who never could gaze enough. The sight brought back to her, as in a flash of swiftest lightning, the wild, wild words she had spoken of him the night her father died. Dimly the recollection of that night had been ever with her, but now she heard herself and saw it all again. She gazed until she found that Arndt had also turned and understood her thought, and then she went from them and softly closed the door. Returning, she reached to him her hand and said, "Do curses, righteous curses, ever work despite the human instrument? And yet have I not also lost? Have I smote him and not my friends? No, no, you had the right. We are so bound that none may smite but he smites all, that none may steal but he thieves from himself. You were most right. We smite a system, not a man. And though we have befriended, pitied, loved that man, still is his life, the life he used to lead, made desolate and a failure. And you are quit of your oath. Here, as though in the presence of the dead, I ask you if you wish to give me up, or whether my father's wealth, now dedicated to the cause we love, shall stand between us any more." Arndt winced. She had probed his most secret thoughts. He answered in her very words, "Remember, you are mine and I am yours, and I will never give you up, unless you want me to." And then he kissed them both, and so they stood and watched the dark creep up to meet the coming day. How long they stood, none knew. Within the room there was no sound until Robert, who had come up noiselessly behind them, said, "Come, I now must hear of all there is to tell. Miss Arndt, you have my heartfelt thanks. I shall never forget that it is you that I owe being able to give my father the answer he wanted." Annie noticed how firm, resolute, manly was the tone of his voice, and she replied, "I did my duty, nothing more. My life and all I have belongs, like yours, to this great cause. Could I do less than I have done?" And then they went down to their friends who were anxiously waiting for them in the library. Owing to the condition of the streets, King and the others had not arrived until after Mr. Endy's death, but they remained to offer their services and sympathy to Robert. Little was said, for supper was soon announced, but afterwards the story of that day was told by Arndt to sympathetic hearers, and when he ended he went to the desk and took from it the paper he had written during that solemn afternoon and handed it to Robert, who immediately asked to be excused and went with it to his father's room. It was then 9 o'clock, and King and Chandler and Arthur decided that they must return to Clyde by the 10 o'clock express, and Kenedy went for his wife to remain with the ladies at the mansion until after the burial of Mr. Endy. As Chandler was leaving, he said to Arndt, "You are named with me on a power of attorney signed by Chambers, and I think it will be best, if you can be spared from here tomorrow, for us to see at once what is in that box of his. I would like to invite Mr. Arthur to be with us when we open it, as he can tell us more about things connected with this case than anyone else." Arndt gave Arthur a cordial invitation, saying at the same time that he did not know what ever possessed Chambers to put his name on such a document, since if he hated anyone on the earth or beyond, it was the man that had struck his friend. He agreed, however, to go to Clyde on the morrow if possible. Soon after the arrival of the Kennedys, the mansion was shrouded in darkness, save where the light gleamed into the night from the window of Mr. Endy's room. There Robert sat, and read the paper and the will enclosed therein, and thought of all the past and planned for the future until the first glimmer of dawn allowed him to extinguish the light, and then he called Rollins to take his place by the side of the dead. Even then he started at the beginning and read those last words of his father once more before retiring. "To my dear son, greeting. My work is done, your begins. First, tear from your heart the love of wealth, for I say unto you that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Second, tear from your heart the love and pride of place, for I say unto you that equality alone can make you free. Third, tear from your heart the love of power, for I say unto you, how can a man love God whom he hath not seen, if he love not his fellow whom he hath seen? And doth he rule by force who loves? Behold, my son, I show you this my secret heart. I have lived far, far from men, live close, close, close to them, to all, for they are God incarnate here, and all his ways are shown in them. By grace of truth this I see now. My work for peace was vain, For war in guise of peace has ever been abroad and stalking through all lands. O wasted years! O blinded eyes! There was a way, a sure and certain way, to peace that never had been yet attained, a way long since declared by those of purest hearts, and I, my son, saw not that way, and spent the fruitless years in casting up a highway of my own, on which the slayer followed in my track. Give heed, my son. This is that why that blinded these fond eyes. This is that why that deafened these too credulous ears. I was, like that young man of old, possessor of much wealth, and could not use the comrade word because of it. Have I not known for years the crimes against God's law and man's committed by the rich? Have I denounced them with a fearless tongue? Have I not paid, with money earned by those who knew not ease, or what man's life should be, a man to speak smooth words to rich men day by day? Have I denounced him when his coward tongue with silence cloaked their evil grasping lives? Why have I not? Look on this earth and say if it is thine. Look on this earth and show your title from its maker to an inch of it. These words I utter lest my blindness should be thine. Yet I have hope that light has dawned on thee, for prison walls cannot bar truth. There is a cry of traitor in the land. My son, I had them in my house and at my board this day. 1 man for 4 years' term, and 9 for life, rule over this fair land, and make a mock of freedom and of law. Beware of them, for they are tools of whosoever can control the purse. I speak as one who is beyond the reach of man, and shortly shall see God. This is not courage, son. Do you show more. There needs not that I say to you to treasure as your dearest friend the man that writes these words for me. Yet will I say it, since the time is short, and I would place on record that I love him well. O child of mine, think what a world this world might be if but equality and justice reigned. Your task is ready to your hand. See that the hour of your departure finds it finished, and the nations one in love and aim, and brothers all, and war forever slain. When future days are dark and dreary, turn from the day, and find a joy that shall illume the blackest cloud in working for and loving outcasts and the unprotected weak, until that day when none of these shall be. Behold, I send you word, the dawning of that day is near at hand. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22, Part 1 of The Recording Angel by Edwin Arnold Brenholtz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 22. The telling of it all by saint or scamp lets in a flood of light. Old truths in new clothes. As fickle as February weather should be a proverb if it isn't, thought Arndt as he faced the keen wind on his way to the station the next morning. Robert had assured him that everything had been attended to that could be, and that he himself was very desirous to know what further revelations there were in store. So Arndt, who, after the previous day's experiences and the excitement of hearing of the death of the president and his secretary, was feeling very much like doing nothing for a day or two, said that it would do him good to walk, and refused the use of the carriage. He had thought to use his pet, but concluded that, although she showed no ill effects from the race of the preceding day, he would let her rest. Jeanette was Arndt's one extravagance. Years before, while walking on a Sunday afternoon in the country with Nettie, she saw the animal, then but a colt, frisking in the pasture, and both of them admired her so much that Arndt invested a good portion of all he had then saved in purchasing her. Jeanette was one cause of Arndt's unpopularity with the men. or rather had been when the strike began, for they insisted that it was aping the rich for a working man to own such an animal as Jeanette had proved to be. We consider every man's extravagance unjustifiable, but our own. Arndt stuck by his pet, and she showed in 100 ways that she loved her owner. Jeanette apparently has nothing to do with the strike, yet it was the comradeship of the man and the brute that first attracted Mr. Endy to Arndt, and finally made him trust him so entirely. We are too prone to accept the visible causes of things as the real causes, and we do it oftentimes because of their largeness or nearness. As Arndt walked briskly along, he was thinking of the petty meanness of the rich men who had dragged his friend Jack Cassidy, cripple as he was, to Washington to testify before the strike commission appointed by the president as to Arndt's owning and supporting Jeanette, and of how their well-fed attorneys had harped on that fact as demonstrating the baselessness of the claims of the strikers. The thought of Jack in his crippled condition caused Arndt to look at his watch, and finding that he had time to spare, he went several blocks out of his way to drop in at the little newsstand where he, with Mr. Endy's aid, had set up Jack in business. By the time he reached the place, he was chilled through and was glad to stand by the stove and chat for a few moments. And in the course of the conversation, Cassidy said, "By the way, Arndt, I want you to put this paper in your pocket, and when you get time, read that little piece in fine print down in the corner that I have marked. It is certainly curious how those capitalistic sheets manage to give, and yet not give, the news that reflects on the doings of the rich. I marked it for you because of that." Arndt was obliged to hurry to catch his train, and when he was comfortably seated, he took out the paper and read, "Some curious developments in the Hotchis will case. Our readers will probably recall the noted case of Robert Hotchis, in which he, the testator, cut off his heirs with as little as the law would allow, and bestowed all the remainder in trust to the cooperative commonwealth, whenever it should be established either in this country or in other lands. The case was taken by him on a feigned issue to the courts during his lifetime, so that litigation after his death might be prevented. The courts decided that the will was perfectly legal. Then his natural heirs attacked his will on the ground that he, the testator, was not of sound and disposing mind. The old gentleman was evidently prepared for that, and during the first day of his examination by the court, gave unimpeachable evidence of his sanity. To the surprise of all, the second day completely established the contention of his heirs, and he was immediately sent to a private sanitarium, where he yesterday killed himself, thereby disclosing the fact that a minute opening had at some time in the past been made through the skull, and through this opening, evidently by means of a hypodermic syringe, some solution, which afterward hardened on the brain, was injected by some person or persons at present unknown. It is probable that when the substance which has been pressing on the brain is analyzed, the detectives may have some clue as to the perpetrators of the crime. At all events, it is a remarkable coincidence that Mr. Hotchis should have fallen a victim to such an outrage at just the moment his heirs were trying to prove his mental unsoundness. But the wealth and social standing of those who now inherit his millions and lands place them beyond suspicion." Arndt smiled sarcastically when the last sentence was finished, and he carefully folded the paper and placed it in his pocket, saying to himself, "I wonder if Arthur has seen that. If not, I have a surprise in store for him." This early express being the train on which the rich and well-to-do traveled from their suburban residences to Clyde, was luxuriously appointed, and made excellent time, and Arndt settled himself comfortably to rest and sleep if possible, for he had not been able to sleep much the night before. But even now his thoughts ran riot. He gave up the effort and glanced about the car in search of someone he knew to whom he could talk. There were several of the men who had been at the meeting, but they had not even noticed him when he entered the car, and he would not have cared to talk to them in any event. Finally he glanced immediately behind him, and was pleased to see Hubert, the poet and novelist, seated there. He was well acquainted with him, and immediately said, "Come over here, will you? I would like to chat with you. I have a question or two to ask you." "Fire away," said Hubert, as soon as he was seated, "but you always want to remember that I am liable to use you and whatever you say as material. We writers run short of material every once in a while, you know." This was said laughingly, but Arndt replied, "In all seriousness, that is the very thing I want to talk about. Now see, I have almost given up reading modern fiction and poetry. And why? The poetry is beautiful, it is polished until it dazzles the senses, it is chaste and refined, but it does not report or represent the life of the world I, nor anyone I know, live in. Its very polish and refinement is its bane. It does not talk a word of the worker's language. From a business standpoint, I suppose that such writing is commendable, since the workers are not in a position to buy poetry, no matter how written. Their pockets are empty, their larders are bare, and their brains have been dulled by incessant toil until poetry, unless it be of the harsh and rugged kind to which you deny the name, is frankly beyond them. So I let the poetry pass. But look at the prose, especially the fiction. What do I find in real life? Take yesterday, for instance. You know its terrible score of prominent men whose lives ended in this small scope of country and within its 24 hours. That is the fact. There is your material. Where do I find its counterpart in fiction?" Hubert smiled at him and said, "No doubt, no doubt. I used to do that sort of thing, wrote poems that stirred your heart and told of things that actually happened. I have several of what I still call my best works nicely typewritten and bound and carefully stored away. Some day, when you have time, call around and I will let you have one of them to read. They are just as easy to read as print, and I have no objection to an appreciative person who is honorable enough to not steal my ideas, reading and enjoying them. Fact is, I would like to convince you that I, at least, do write real life in some of my fiction. It is true, there is little of the genuine article in my published works. You can't tell me anything about that. And the exasperating thing about it is that I know the works would be read if some prominent publishing house would print and circulate them. But although my works are popular, they won't, for their critics would immediately cry out against the occurrences of yesterday, that they were not art, and that their presentation destroyed the artistic quality of the book. See? And the worst of it, from your point of view, is, I suppose, that the critics and the public between them have convinced me, and now I turn out literature. Well, here we are almost at Clyde." Arndt, with the ardor of a new convert, said, "And yet they assert that the socialist state would be the death of art. It seems to me that what you have said is a confession that the life the capitalistic state brings about is so inartistic that you cannot truthfully portray it and at the same time turn out artistic work. Socialism, art or no art for me." Had Arndt been keeping up with Hubert's latest work, he would not have been surprised when the silver-tongued poet arose and hastily picked up his coat, saying, "Permit me, sir, to retract that invitation. I do not consider a socialist trustworthy or a gentleman." They had reached their destination, and Hubert left without saying good-bye. As Arndt followed him out of the car, he said to himself, "Phew! Slap in the face number 1. Nice outlook." And he was sympathizing with the men who have patiently endured that sort of thing all through the years for one despised cause or another, until he arrived at Chandler's office. The earliest possible moment of opening the outer doors found the three men at the deposit building, and their eagerness was such that they were astonished when they learned that after attending to all preliminaries they had still several minutes to wait. Chandler said, "Well, for once I've no use for time locks on vaults." Arndt, who was the most composed of the party, said, "Nevertheless, they are splendid safeguards, and we can't always have things work our way. I have tried to think of a single thing which did not appear to work hardship to some one at times, and I cannot remember one. I try to never forget, especially when I am in a hurry, as true a thing as ever I heard, namely, there is an eternity behind and another ahead of you. A few moments will not matter." "That's the talk," said Arthur. "But I can't always remember in time." "Neither do I," said Arndt. At this moment the time locks opened, and as the bolts flew back and the great doors that admitted them to where the smaller safes were stored swung open, each man found himself holding his breath. In a few moments the box was placed in their hands, and they were conducted to a private room in the building. As they opened the lock, the lid raised slightly, and they all involuntarily drew back. Arndt, who was standing nearest to the table, said, "We are somewhat nervous, are we not?" And reaching across Chandler, who had just stepped up, he threw back the lid. Immediately on top were some typewritten directions for operating a certain talking machine. In large letters the heading said, "This machine has never been patented. Inventor is dead. Letters of assignment of all rights to Archibald Chambers, his heirs or assigns are hereto attached." Then followed special features of invention: smallness, lightness, silent working, capacity of cylinder, exact reproduction of voice, time switch, by which cylinder commences to revolve either instantaneously or after 5, 10, 15, or 20 minutes, and pitch regulator, by which ordinary continuous sounds are not recorded, and a switch controlling automatic repeater. Under this was another typewritten paper, headed "Confession of Archibald Chambers," and under this was the wonderful little machine. Every part of it showed by its perfection and beauty that it was the output of an expert who had delighted in his work. They said nothing as Arndt took it out of the box and placed it on the table, and then sat down and read the instructions for running it. When he finished, Arthur exclaimed, "Just what might have been expected. That man certainly had brains, and I am going to tell you right now that in spite of all Chambers may say or have said to anyone, I know, or at least feel certain, that while others may have made the parts, it was Chambers himself that furnished the brains and assembled this perfect machine. But let us hear what the instrument has to say, although I expect that I have already listened to some of it." While he was speaking, Arndt followed the instructions and unscrewed the electric light bulb from its wire, and then attached the wire to the machine. "Electric motor!" exclaimed Arthur. "By Jove, it would run forever!" "Either way," said Arndt, "wind it up if you want to." A touch of oil here and there, and the machine was in running order, and again all hesitated to make the last move, but this time it was the detective who reached towards it and pushed the lever which Arndt had set for instantaneous action. Immediately there rolled through the room the sonorous tones of a voice which every man knew to be that of Mr. Craggie, and they all, in spite of themselves, looked towards the door. The delusion was so perfect that in listening to the voice and marveling at its strength, they had lost some of the words, for Arndt had set the machine for its loudest pitch and greatest speed. It had seemed not possible for so small an instrument to talk at all without the aid of a multiplier. He now reduced the speed and the volume and started it again, and then every sense that could be brought to bear was concentrated on the words and the instrument. Arndt and Chandler were very quiet, and kept their gaze riveted on the revolving cylinder, but the detective watched the faces of the other two. As the talk suddenly stopped after the words, "Anybody being killed?" Arndt said, as he drew a quick breath, "If he were not already dead, it would take even more money than a Craggie ever had to save him, I think." All except Arthur were startled when the talk once more commenced abruptly, and then again suddenly ended at the same moment that there was a faint click. The cylinder stopped. Arthur sprang to his feet, exclaiming, "By the Eternal! That clears up the last thing. That man ought to have lived. I need him in my business." "Yes," said Arndt, "it clears it up. He stopped where he did because he had to, and you never found it out, nor even suspected it." "I never did," was the candid reply. Chandler was looking inquiringly at them. Arthur had not gone into details about Mr. Craggie's experience with Chambers while telling the story in the car. He had spoken much more freely to Arndt the previous night. When he saw Chandler's look, he realized that the lawyer was still in the dark. So they sat there with the silent machine on the table before them and the unopened confession on the lid of the box, while Arthur told again of the way that Chambers had driven the president to the verge of distraction. But he said nothing about the actual plan of Mr. Craggie for controlling Mr. Endy, and the others understood that having heard it in the way he had, he would never be at liberty to reveal it. So Chandler listened carefully and without interruption until he told about the receipt of the daily letters from the Confederate on the outside, and then Chandler lifted up his hands in astonishment and appeared to be speechless. His companions gazed at him in wondering silence for a while, and then Arndt remarked, "It might be just as well to tell us all about it, Harry. If you need any assistance, say so." "Well, I do, and if it were anybody but Chambers that had done me in this way I should never admit it, not even to you. But the fact is that he had no Confederate on the outside, so far as I know, unless you look on me as one. I expect that I wrote every one of those letters, sealed and mailed them myself, and there wasn't a word in any one of them but letter received, not even a date or signature." "How on earth did he ever get you to do it, and you with your experience with criminals?" said Arthur. Then Chandler narrated all his dealings with Chambers, and when he had finished he added, "I said the last time he was at my office, and I say it again, that man is too smart for me. Only, gentlemen, with your permission, I will change the last word." "By all means, yes, sir," said Arthur. "Make it us." They were recalled to the confession by Arndt's words. "After all, and in spite of his rascality, I liked Chambers." And he added with a sigh, "I am sorry for him. I confess that I do not understand him at all. Let us see what he has to say for himself." Arndt handed the paper to Chandler to read, and they all leaned back in their chairs waiting for him to begin. But he sat with the open paper before him and stared at it, and at last he said below his breath, "That man is better dead than living. He was too smart." "Begin," said Arndt. Without any explanation of his remark, Chandler said, "Confession of Archibald Chambers. To the 3 men who will first read this confession. Gentlemen, I am risking having the laugh on me one time, but as I will not be present to hear it, that one time will not matter. I think that there will be 3 of you, since you are all alive at the moment of this writing, which is 2 o'clock of February 18th. "The very afternoon he visited my office the last time," interrupted Chandler. "The very afternoon the president set me on his trail," said Arthur. Chandler resumed, "I feel confident that Mr. Arthur will be of your number, and I would place his name on the power of attorney, only it seemed useless, Being a detective, he will probably by this time know more of my doings than anyone but myself, and I want to clear up the few points that are, I presume, obscure to his mind. I hope that he has enjoyed tracking me as much as I have enjoyed fooling him and all the others. He will appreciate the fine points of my work more than most men, and I hope that he is now present as you read this. He will probably be the man to arrest me, and so one of those to see me die, and I want his testimony to confirm my words that I embraced the quietness brought by the greatest friend of man as a lover accepts the offered kiss of his sweetheart. Passionately, thankfully. Of course, I killed myself. When I put that long, slender, bright brown cigar of Craggie's into the compartment in my case, where you will find that my short, thick black ones will not go, I forced it firmly on to the lance-shaped spring concealed there, which pierced it, and at the same time injected the poison into the cigar. As soon as I bit off the end of the cigar, which I swallowed, forgive me for speaking in the past tense, I feel that way, I knew that everything had worked satisfactorily. With criminals working for selfish ends, Arthur and the other detectives are all right, but they stood no chance with me. Arthur played into my hands finely, or at least I know he will. I suppose that Mr. Craggie is now in prison. I hope so. I want to give him a chance to experience some things. I want to give him a good scare. I want to teach him how the inside of a jail feels to a man who is innocent of the particular crime with which he stands charged. I hope that no personal harm has come to him at the hands of the mob. Some years ago I would have rejoiced at such a termination of it all, but not now. I have no desire that others should be involved in his punishment. Still, it has to be risked, and if things turn out that way, you can console yourselves, even as I do, by the thought that on general principles he deserves all he will ever get. But I prefer that he shall die some other way. There is an ideal executioner for Mr. Craggie. I am acquainted with him. I want to clear myself of one thing. It is a matter of keen regret with me that Mr. Endy has had to suffer so much. That was entirely unintentional. He is a good man, but he has had all the pleasures which wealth could bestow throughout his life, and he has had an exceptionally pleasant time. He had just embarked on a course which, to my mind, was and is certain to bring him worry, trouble, and defeat for his most cherished project. I think that the strikers themselves will eventually wound him deeply. I have no faith in their gratitude, and in any event they must sooner or later enlist in the Socialist ranks. That would hurt him sorely. On the other hand, he is deluding himself with the hope that the rich will rally to his aid. As you will learn later, Mr. Craggie has worked out just such a scheme to head off Socialism when the day comes that he must commence to make concessions. I need scarcely say that, being his, it is not in the interest of the men. Some such thoughts were in my mind when I went to the Endy mansion that night after reading the words of Mr. Craggie, which placed him completely in my power. But at first I thought only of grasping the opportunity to bring to an end the task I had set for myself, and I did not then think of any man's suffering. I fully expected that Mr. Endy would not suffer, inasmuch as I intended to give him as peaceful and quiet a departure as I have secured for myself. I felt that he might just as well step down and out then as at any time. You know, when one has to live daily with a man who thinks nothing of forcing men to strike, well, knowing that many innocent women and children will necessarily starve to death, one is bound to become reckless in regard to the life of a single individual. Well, I expected to find Mr. Endy asleep, and in that event he would simply have continued to sleep forever, which is probably easier and better than nature will now do for him. But he awoke as I was leaning over the bed and grappled with me, and then, because my work was not finished, I had to grapple with him and defend myself. He is a brave old man. He never cried out until I struck him.
I'm sorry for him, sorry for every moment of suffering I caused him. Mr. Craggie was the cause. I shall make Mr. Craggie pay for his suffering and my regret. A few more words in explanation of that act. I will say that for 10 mortal years I have been under sentence of death and daily suffering physical tortures almost unendurable, and that, because I would not sacrifice my keenness of intellect by using opiates, there have been many hours when, had the power been mine, I would willingly have depopulated this globe at a stroke in order to end my own sufferings and that of others, and would have considered that act the most merciful one ever performed. Such was my mood that night. End of chapter 22, part 1 of 2. Chapter 22, Part 2 of The Recording Angel by Edwin Arnold Brenholtz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 22, continued. When I first entered the employ of Craggie, I was apparently in perfect health, and thought that I saw a clear road ahead to the attainment of my goal. But one day I felt twinges and sharp pains that disturbed me, and the physician I consulted looked very grave, very grave. The drugs he gave me brought only temporary relief, and I was soon compelled to choose between them and the ability to go on with my work, my life work, I mean. Then I had an opportunity to consult the most eminent specialist in the world while we were once at San Francisco, and I heard with dismay that my doom was sealed, years of suffering ahead, and an agonizing death in the end. I am not one to hesitate. At the next stopping place I had a true friend, and you would be surprised to know how many friends I have had and have, who was able to procure for me the means of a painless release. For this I thank him again. I have already rewarded him. Now, on the day preceding the attack on Mr. Endy, and in fact ever since the strike began, Craggie had been using and abusing me worse than usual. The terrific speed at which we traveled increased my sufferings 100-fold, and yet I had to wear, if not a smiling, at least an unruffled countenance. You know how that gets on one's nerve. I was perfectly savage when I left the car, and when I heard what the machine had to tell me, I saw my opportunity in an instant, and neither hesitated nor feared. What is a man to fear who has had death in concrete form ready to his hand for 10 years? And this will explain my apparent recklessness and audacity. Craggie could not reach me. I had made a league with death. The day that assured Craggie's downfall and defeat was marked, long years ago, as the day for me and death to meet. In the carrying out of my plans, I have made myself indispensable to Craggie, have aided him in every way to attain his ambition, have unobtrusively suggested fine points of play continually, have never balked no matter how disagreeable or even dishonorable the task assigned me, and all to the end of elevating him the higher in order to ensure the greater fall. And he has improved wonderfully under my tutelage, though even today he is no more capable of running things without my assistance than he is of keeping the earth in its orbit should the forces that hold it there relax. Did you ever see a worse managed business than this strike? He took things in his own hands. I recognize the inconsistency of my character full well. I cause a man to be discharged and blacklisted, and then, if it has been due to the carrying out of my plan, I aid him in every way possible. One holding my present opinion of mankind in general should not do so. That is me before the world refused to stand by me and redress a great wrong done to one I loved. I am no philanthropist. To me man seems a pretty sorry animal, and very largely a hypocrite. Craggie, for instance, has been just as directly the murderer of thousands of soldiers who have died in wars he brought about to increase his wealth and power as the individual who plans the death of another and strikes the blow with his own hand. He has time after time stolen the total earnings of his employees by removing and consolidating his works without making any provision for them or giving them any compensation for the homes they had paid for out of their hard-earned wages, which homes they were then obliged to abandon or sell for what they could get. And yet he and men like him claim to despise and detest a murderer and a thief. I tell you, he has potentially murdered me 100 times. All he lacked was courage and opportunity. I want you to rid your minds of the idea that money is what I am after. And yet what foolish sentimentality this is, which makes me wish to justify myself in the sight of Chandler, to whom I feel drawn. If you think that money was my object, you were never more wrong in your lives. I have been taking down Craggie's words with the aid of the little machine for a purpose, and since the night of the attack on Mr. Endy, I have been playing with him as a cat does with a mouse it fully intends to destroy. In that I have been paying myself for having endured his treatment for 15 years. In order that you may understand this perfectly, I give you permission to read the copy of the letter I'm going to hand him at the last moment. I told him that I had appropriated the corruption fund. The fact is, I used it to help support the men I found it necessary to discharge, and to lessen some of the suffering caused by his cruel methods. Every dollar I this day possess has been honestly earned, and earned several times over. The $800,000 has reached the Treasury of the Union in the shape of anonymous contributions from all over the United States. For this purpose our recent trip suited me precisely, although the traveling was about the worst thing for me physically that could have been. I suffered tortures every hour. But the mental enjoyment I derived in various ways, and not least in seeing how the sums I sent out seemed to stimulate large gifts by others, helped me to hold out until certain of Craggie's defeat. Whenever I could do so during this strike, I headed off the president's moves. I claim no credit for this. I was simply prolonging his punishment. I took considerable pleasure in doing this, and in using the money as I did. It seems to me to be poetic justice of the finest quality that the money, if we call it Mr. Craggie's, should be used to defeat him, and if we call it the workingmen's, should be used to help them break the chains he and other rich men have been slowly and surely forging for the purpose of reducing them to absolute slavery to a class. And then it made me smile to think of the impeccable, upright, and honorable Mr. Arndt acting, though unconsciously, as my agent in the distribution of stolen money, if you persist in calling it that. I have been in daily contact with a rich man too long to be squeamish about a phrase. I have no objection to a name. Only please be impartial. Call most of Craggie's wealth by the same title. Mr. Arndt will understand that while I know him to be as honest as a man may be, under a system where the very earth on which he lives has been stolen, still I have no use for his high-flown theories. It always fills me with pity to see a man wasting his energies. Why doesn't he go in for socialism and have a show of success, if he believes that men really wish others to be happy and prosperous? I assure you I don't believe any such thing, and if he doesn't like what I have done with the money, he can get the strikers to return it to Craggie, or his heirs. I am somewhat skillful in mechanics, and handy with tools. Mr. Arthur will probably have found the little secret compartment in my room back of the berth. It was very easy to find time and opportunity to take out the decorative panel and fix it so that it would open by pushing the spring concealed in the molding around it. You will understand that Mr. Craggie was absent from the car many times when he was supposed to be in it. There were many occasions when he did not desire my company or services. Read that letter to him, and you will know what I did with my time on such occasions.
In the compartment will be found the little collapsible pasteboard box which assumed the size of the daily package of bills and came back to the car every night in my pocket. The money never left the car. I retired to my room to count it, and then fixed the box in shape, and after hiding the money, I brought the box out and set it on the table in plain sight of the president, but always done up in the identical wrapper that had covered the bills. That is all that you will find there. For the money, corruption fund, and all of the other is, as I said, disposed of. The check enclosed herewith is for the full amount I have in the bank, and this I desire to have distributed pro rata among the men whose names will be found on the accompanying list. These persons are those whom I have not yet been able to properly reward for kindnesses and services rendered. Somehow, life always finds us indebted to others, and death catches us ever in arrears. I depend on you to carry out my wishes in every particular, but especially as regards these gifts, for I know of no other world in which one may square accounts. Had I might have left Craggy to the ruler of it for punishment. And, speaking of him, leads me to remark that I am not naturally a cruel man, but the universe seems to be so constructed and run that a man cannot advance himself without making other people suffer. It is conceivable that the Socialist is right, and that things might be different under his system, but I have had to take men as I found them, and society as I found it. I had no time for theories. I had Craggy to get even with and punish. In my progress through his works, and in his office, every time I took a step upward, I pushed somebody off a rung on the ladder, and in holding the position of secretary all these years, I have deprived just as able men of the position. I have always been sorry for them. I have always been sorry for the small fry I have eaten. This is vastly more than Craggy, or any millionaire I know of, can truthfully say. There are no persons who have any legal claims on me. Your power of attorney will, I think, be all that is necessary to enable you to carry out every one of my wishes. I hereby give to you the little machine as a remuneration for your services. Do with it as you will. I suppose that the hair found in the hand of Mr. Endy has been an unsolved riddle. As I am clearing up what Arthur has not been able to find out, I will tell you this also. The president would strenuously deny that the hair is his, but it is. We were just leaving the Pittsburgh works after the telegrams announcing the death of MacDonald had been received, and one of the men overheard Craggy remark, "Yes, they will probably strike." "Thank God for that," said the fellow, and Craggy turned and discharged him on the spot, and said to me, "Find out who he is and have him blacklisted." We were near the outer gate, and no one was for the moment in sight. I am such a slightly built man that the fellow did not take me into account at all, and he just made one jump and caught Craggy and clutched him by the throat. "A man might just a little better die for killing such a damnable nuisance as you than to starve to death for want of work," said he, as he relaxed his hold on the throat so as to free his right arm, and at the same instant he clutched the president by the hair and drew back that powerful right arm to strike. Now, I had a reason for wishing that Craggy should not be killed out of hand like that, and as I was a little behind his assailant and can do some striking, scientific striking, myself, that blow never landed. Mine did. Craggy hastened to the car as soon as the man touched the ground, but I remained to see whether he was badly hurt. I had not struck to kill him, and soon brought him to, and in his grasp I found the bunch of hairs which have put the detectives to so much trouble. I kept them at the time, not only as a souvenir of the event, but also in order to remind Craggy at some future day that if I took his life, I had previously saved it. Now everybody knows that Craggy has always prided himself on his personal popularity with the men in his employ. Whether he really believes the fiction and takes the shouts and applause seriously, I have never been able to fully determine. Being Craggy, it is possible that he does. I stayed with the man until he had fully recovered, and then I asked his name and whether he had a wife and children. He said that he had, but that they were still in the old country. Then I told him that his chance in this land of the free was gone, since I would have to obey orders, and I advised him to leave at once. He said that he had not much money laid by, since he had been sending a part of his wages each month to his family. And on his promising to take the first steamer for Germany, I handed him the $1,000 bill I usually carry. But he was afraid to accept so large a bill, and I went with him to the office, had him properly discharged, paid off and blacklisted, and then I got the bill broken into smaller notes, and when we were safely outside and out of sight, I gave them to him. I did my best to pay for the blow, and I know that he kept his word and left immediately and never gave me away. And if he has the sense to remain in a country where only one ordinary kingling rules the roast, and not a— but let that go. He will do very well, and have to thank me for knocking him senseless. I suppose that Craggie reported to Arthur that I had fleeced him of 1,000 the day after the attack on Mr. Endy. That was the 1,000 I gave to his assailant. If he is still alive, tell him that. That was a chance I necessarily missed to nag him. When I returned to the car, he wanted to know what had detained me so long, and I told him that I had been attending to his orders in person, and that satisfied him, and he remarked, "Mr. Chambers, I will be under even greater obligations to you than I now am if the press does not find out anything about this day's doings. To think of being choked and strangled and almost murdered by one of the men whom I have been supporting, yes, literally keeping alive, is humiliating enough without hearing anyone talk about it. I do not know how to sufficiently thank you for just simply getting rid of the man and not prosecuting him for criminal assault. I really feared that your long absence was caused by some such action." The next day, Craggie changed from lay-down collars to the extremely high and ultra-fashionable ones he has since affected, and it was quite a while thereafter when he had his hair-cutting and beard-trimming attended to. And I think that I will not have to take many words to explain how, with the knowledge that there would be a spasmodic, involuntary clutching at the air and an instant struggle for breath on the part of the person who swallowed the drug then in my possession, the thought to use those hairs and leave the label of the bottle as if it had been slipped off in the scuffle came to me when I heard Craggie's words about anybody being killed. Of course, as it turned out, all that plan went askew, and it cost me an instant's delay to thrust those hairs into Mr. Endy's hand, and that instant almost landed me in Arndt's arms. I think that you can understand all the rest. I must hurry with what I have yet to say, for the deposit vaults will soon close. I must say good-bye to my friend. As I remarked before, I have no particular love for mankind in general. Those who do not believe in either hell or devil, and yet try to live so as to cause as little suffering to others as may be, show that there is still good stuff in the race, cropping out in the few, but there is many a man walking straight enough today, solely because of a cowardly fear of an imaginary devil or an actual policeman. Otherwise, many more of the injuries sustained by men at the hands of their fellows would meet vengeance here and now. Still, my idea is that they are each doing about as well as could be expected of them under the circumstances, and I really desire that the sick and suffering shall get the benefit I can secure them. For this purpose I give my body to the hospital at Clyde. In the dissecting room, the physicians and surgeons may find out something about my disease that will enable them to lessen some poor fellow's misery. A last word about Craggie. He murdered and robbed my father, and should have died under any just law. There was no such law. All his transactions in that case were strictly legal. I, at least, have secured his loss of power, and that, to him, would be worse than death. Still he should die. But, perchance,
You and the strikers may not use the evidence I have placed in your hands. If you let him escape the result of his actions after I have put him within your power, you will deserve the slavery he intends for you. And worse than that I could not wish you. I believe that is all. Archibald Chambers. Afterthought. I leave you one unsolved problem. What was Craigie's plan? I do not know. I know what, but not how. Archibald Chambers Redmond. That I know, for Mr. Craggie told me, said Arthur. I think I know, said Arndt, and he pulled from his pocket the paper Cassidy had given him and handed it to the others, who read the marked item at the same time. Arthur said, I see. I might as well have told you all. But what does that last signature mean? Arndt replied, Can't tell you, but let us look for that letter to Mr. Craggie. Evidently he thought that in destroying the one Chambers gave to him, the world would never know the truth. He calculated without remembering Chambers. The letter was soon discovered, inside some others, and Arthur read it aloud. My dear Mr. Craggie, I thus address you because I have given over the idea of killing you. To that extent I have forgiven you. Do you remember the words of Byron? For time at last sets all things even, and if we do but watch the hour, there never yet was human power that could evade, if unforgiven, the patient search and vigil long of him who treasures up a wrong. Also, do you remember one Jasper C. Redmond? I am his son. He was your friend. 10 million was what you individually made by bankrupting him. He and I was then 19 and at school in Germany, came in from a brisk walk in the country one beautiful autumn evening, and as we passed the desk at the hotel, the clerk handed him a telegram marked important. He took it, went smiling to his room, and an hour afterwards there was heard a pistol shot, and I found myself a poverty-stricken orphan in a foreign land. I need not recall to your mind the great financial coup by which you and several others took every cent of his money and added it to your other legally gotten gains. I have heard you refer to it so often as the beginning of your individual career that to more than name it would be superfluous. Suffice to say that I dropped the Redmond, and after working at whatever offered in Germany for 2 years, during which I matured my plans and thought out a certain little machine, I returned to my native land and secured a position, first in your works and soon in your New York office. Since then, I have been ever with you. I have but a few words more for you. There is a large box full of the records containing scraps of conversations gathered from time to time, which will show to the world the real motives, methods, and final aims of the millionaire rulers of this country. There are many other prominent men's words on them besides yours. I have corroborated the testimony by compiling the acts of legislators, judges, governors, and others, by documentary evidence wherever it could be attained, and I have put the whole in the form of a book. Joy of the work has been the narcotic that has deadened the pain of my mortal agony when at its worst, at night. Those records will come to the hands of the proper parties the day after my death, and at the same time the manuscript of the book entitled The Great Conspiracy will be delivered to the same men. They are true patriots and will know what to do with those records and that book. There are still several monarchies on the face of the earth where it is not a crime to work for the overthrow of a republic and the enslavement of its people, or possibly, since you live but for power, and power is this day taken from you, you had better follow the example I shall set you. A word to the wise is sufficient. Archibald C. Redmond. Redmond? Redmond?" said Arndt. "Same name as on the assignment of the rights to the machine to Chambers," said Chandler. "I see," said Arndt. Arthur was right once more. And then they placed on the machine one after another of the accusing and condemning cylinders, and heard brutal, man despising and treasonable sentiments expressed until they grew sick at heart. Among them was one that Chandler had Arndt have the machine repeat, and he took it down word for reference. First Chambers' voice: "The Socialists are educating the people to the value and sacredness of the ballot." Then Mr. Craggie's: "The Socialists are a set of idealist fools. The mass of the people of this and of all the lands are, and ever have been, totally unfit for the ballot, and I can buy it for 25 cents a head per vote from millions of them, and reason the majority into using it my way in a 15 minutes talk. The people are unfit for popular government. They have had none of it in this or any land that I know of for, these many years. And that is why things have gone so well as they have. We allow them to change a president once in so often, but there have been enough vacancies on the Supreme Court bench during the last 20 years to place that body forever in my control. Oh, no, I do not buy them. Not at all. But I recommended some of them because I already knew their sentiments, and the others I endorsed after I found out where they stood as between the rich and the workers. And you want to remember that they are in for life. Old Tom Jefferson was eminently sane when he said that the liberty of this people would find its grave in the federal judiciary, or words to that effect. Fortunate for us that the people did not believe him. And that's the way we have escaped giving these people a despotism like that of the Tsar of Russia, which is in reality all that any people are fit for. Some men are born to rule, some to serve. And the day may come, it may be very close at hand, when we will drop the mask and throne our ruler and have done with foolishness. In that day I will take good care of you, Mr. Chambers." And as Chandler folded the paper and placed it in his pocket, Arndt said, "Ready to come with us, Harry?" "How now?" "I think that you had been rather worshipping that Supreme Court," said Arndt. "I enlisted heart and soul and body with the Socialist yesterday." "And I, this hour. I am awake, wide awake," said Chandler. "Count me in," said Arthur. "The cooperative commonwealth will be plenty good enough for me. I'm rather tired of inequality and oppression." "Let's bundle this machine and all these papers together and take them out to Robert," said Arndt. "Good idea," said Chandler. "He is in need of something to divert his mind from his father's death, and I rather think that this will do it. There's nothing like having plenty of light on a subject." "Light, light, more light," said Arthur. "And perfect courage to live up to what we have," said Chandler. "Amen," said Arndt. End of chapter 22, part 2 of 2. Chapter 23 of The Recording Angel by Edwin Arnold Brenholtz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 23. Men mistake. It is senseless to curse the devil. The recording angel causes all the trouble. Old truths in new clothes. It was 1 o'clock when the 3 men came out of the deposit building, and they soon found that things had not been standing still. On the contrary, much had happened that Arndt should have been informed of. No sooner was the death of President Craggie announced that Martinvale forgot all his pledges to Mr. Endy and commenced to scheme and agitate to have the men return to work under the old order of things, of course granting them certain concessions.
Under his instructions, the first vice president of the corporation immediately issued a secret call for a meeting of the board of directors. That meeting was being held while Arndt and the others were listening to the confessions of Chambers. The first intimation of it he received was when he was handed a summons to attend a meeting of the strike committee in Clyde to consider proposals from the new president of the Iron and Steel Company, Mr. Martinvale. That gentleman had easily succeeded in convincing the board that he could end the strike, and he knew that if he did so he would be elected to succeed himself at the regular meeting to be held in a few days, the 1st of March. The summons was handed to Arndt just as he was entering the train for Steelton, and both he and Chandler left the machine and papers in charge of Arthur with instructions to proceed at once with them to the mansion and to await their arrival. Then they went to the committee room with all speed. When they entered they felt at once that the moral atmosphere of the assembly was unfavorable to them, and Arndt was not one whit surprised to hear President Trueman address him very coldly and distinctly. "Mr. Arndt, we are very much surprised to learn that you have so seriously displeased the new president that he makes it a condition precedent to dealing with us at all that you be dropped from this committee. Of course, after your faithful services and generous sacrifices for the workingmen's cause in the past, we would not take such action, but—" There was quite a pause, and Arndt did not help him by even a motion of the lips. Then Trueman said, "You know that I, personally, insisted on your being on the subcommittee, and I did so because I considered that you were one of the men that were and would be beyond the reach and influence of the socialist element in our body, and—" "Did Mr. Martinvale tell you what caused me to enlist under the socialist banner?" Arndt interrupted him and asked. "No, sir, and I do not think that anything could justify such a course." "Permit me, sir, to believe that you are patriot enough to change your mind if Mr. Martinvale would tell you the whole truth about it," said Arndt as he walked towards the table in the center of the room around which the committee were seated. And then he sat down, without removing his overcoat, and wrote a resignation which he handed to the secretary. When he arose he said, "I hope that I shall always love the cause of the laborer enough to sacrifice anything I have or am honored with in his interest. I regret deeply that in this instance I am obliged to conclude that what is going to be done by his representatives is diametrically opposed to his very existence. I know Martinvale. He is Craggy multiplied tenfold. He will probably offer you all that we felt able to demand at the beginning of this strike in exchange for a pledge that there shall be no strike for 5 years." He paused and glanced around the table and saw that he had hit the mark, and then he proceeded, "I will tell you plainly, you know as well as I do that the Union never gave you power or authority to decide for them in any such matter, but that you would be sustained by the courts of this country in usurping power I have not a doubt. And I am here to tell you that if Martinvale is to have his way without even the right to strike for 5 years, he will, with the aid of the other rich men of this country, have his plans so nicely adjusted that when the Socialists win, as they certainly will at the next presidential election, you will find yourselves with a president who refuses to step down and out on your hands. And I think that all of you are intelligent enough to know what that signifies." He turned to leave the room, but Chandler said, "Wait a moment, Charlie." And then Chandler turned to the committee and said, "Gentlemen, I believe that this is the most sorrowful moment of my life. I have this day and yesterday listened to evidence which makes it impossible to hope for any real freedom for the working man outside of the cooperative commonwealth for which the Socialist is working. Of course, I realize that you have not heard all of this evidence, but certainly enough has come to your knowledge during this strike to convince you of the truth of what I say. I repeat that I am sorrowful.
It is because I had hoped to work actively hand in hand with you to the end of my life. But the same objection that is urged against Arndt will prevent my enjoying your full confidence as heretofore. Without that no man can serve you as you should be served. I therefore resign as your counsel, and will hand over all papers in my possession to your duly accredited representative at any time you may designate." 5 of those sitting there astonished Trueman by rising and saying that they could no longer serve if Arndt was not retained. That left barely a quorum, and although entirely illegal, it was that quorum that, without waiting to have the places of the others filled, accepted Martinvale's proposals, he assuring them beforehand of the endorsement of their action by the courts. There was wild rejoicing throughout the land within an hour. The news that the great strike was over, that the most favorable terms had been granted the men, that all except perhaps a handful of malcontents were entirely satisfied, that there would be no strike for 5 years, and much more, was flashed over the length and breadth of the country, and Trueman and his associates were loudly praised for having had the courage to exceed their authority. For at that early stage it was not denied by anyone that they had done so. And Arndt said sadly to Chandler as they took their seats in the dining car of the 2:30 express, "You may depend on it, the papers will not have type large enough to chronicle what they will truly call Martinvale's victory. When will it dawn on the workers that it is surely their defeat if it is his victory?" "That is just what the Socialist has always been telling us, and that is just what you and I, no longer ago than yesterday, refused to see. Don't forget that, comrade," said Chandler hopefully. "And therefore there is great probability that the remainder of the race will see it some day, in due time." But Arndt was terribly cast down, and he was induced to take a more hopeful view of things only when reminded of the evidence they had now in hand to prove the truth of their assertion and the absolutely incontrovertible shape in which Chambers had placed it. "That is the encouraging feature," said Arndt. "You are right, for although most of us have known many of the things the little machine recorded, our knowledge has heretofore never been in a shape that we could use it. To show up this or that rascality or violation of the law, to be absolutely convinced of the purchasing of a judge or legislature, did no good. There was always the law that they themselves had framed and passed that closed the mouth of the living. But how are they going to prevent the dead? How are they going to hush a machine speaking with the voice of Craggie? When they arrived at Steelton there was, of course, no carriage to meet them at the station, and so they walked by the way of the river road to the mansion. It did Arndt good to hear the wash of the water against the bank of the stream, every inch of which was familiar to him. The trees seemed like faithful friends, the very sparrows seemed like acquaintances, and their harsh voices did not jar on him. As they passed the MacDonald house, Chandler said, "I suppose you will be married to Miss Nettie soon. Is it her intention to tear down the old house and build a larger and more commodious one?" Arndt replied, "Really, Harry, I cannot tell you anything as to the first, for there has been so little time since her recovery in which to plan anything. But as to that last, I can say positively that I know her mind well enough to assure you that whatever the amount of money left by her father may be, her and my manner of life shall not be changed. I have always been a working man, I will always be a working man, and will never adopt the manners and customs of the rich. Besides, we are entirely consecrated to the cause of Socialism, and the cause will need much money as well as hard work. You can rely upon it that we will live as simply and as unostentatiously as may be, and that every cent of the income shall be used each year. My preference would, of course, be to go back into the works and earn my daily bread as before. But Martinvale will be sure to prevent that. I think he would even head me off abroad unless I dropped my name and secured a position under an alias, and that I will never do.
In a measure I am forced to do as Hartley wishes, but we have already felt the mailed hand of the rich, and I now know that a struggle lies ahead of us. But Nettie will never be a source of weakness to me, and we need each other. It will depend entirely on her as to when we are married." When they reached the mansion they found that Arthur had arrived safely, and that during the morning a large box directed to Robert Endy had arrived by express from Clyde. Thinking that it was for him, Robert had at once caused it to be opened, and of course did not know what to do with the cylinders, since they would not fit any phonograph or other style of talking machine he had ever seen. But the book, which was packed in with the cylinders, he could very well understand, and until Arthur's arrival he had been engrossed in reading it. Great as was his astonishment at the contents of the book, it would have been infinitely greater had he not been prepared for something of the kind by what Arthur had told him. But even so, it at times seemed incredible that such sentiments as were therein expressed had been harbored, much less uttered, by an American citizen. And when Chandler and Arndt arrived, they were at once shown to Robert's room, where they found him and Arthur listening to a conversation, or at least to scraps from it, that had at one time taken place between Mr. Craggie and a former president of the United States. As soon as he saw them, Robert said, "This is the most marvelous little machine, and the story it tells is the most astounding revelation that ever was. After hearing what Arthur had to communicate about Chambers' confession, I willingly admit that I do not know in what condition my mind is as to him, and I feel for him what I never thought to feel for the man that struck my father. But what are we to do with this book and these records?" "Do with them?" asked all the men together, and Arndt hastened to add, "Why, surely, Robert, that is easy to answer. We must publish the book as soon as may be, and substantiate what it says by public lectures through the length and breadth of this land, and perhaps even in foreign countries, and these lectures shall be reinforced by the actual language of those men as recorded on the cylinders." But Robert said decidedly, "That sounds very convincing, but have you any desire to be shot at sunrise some fine morning with nothing at all accomplished? Let me tell you, Charlie, my years of close connection and communication with the men who are at the head of affairs teaches me to go rather circumspectly about telling the whole truth publicly. I don't believe that if such a lecture were announced 15 minutes before it was to be uttered, or if the book were published secretly and then we should attempt to send it out, that the lecture would ever be delivered or the book reach the parties to whom it was addressed. But I have no desire to influence you in the matter. I am speaking for the good of the cause. I would like a consultation at once on this subject. Now, what do you say to sending for Kennedy and for King and having him bring from Clyde old Hartley, the Socialist editor, who has been a worker in the ranks, as well as an influential man in the party for many years? Let them all meet here tonight. There will be plenty of time for them to catch the train that arrives at Steelton at 8. Father will not be buried until day after tomorrow, in order to give time for some relatives from the East to arrive. We cannot wait till after that to attend to this. And so it might be just as well done at once. It will be only going immediately about the work he desired me to do, and is surely better than mourning about what I nor anyone can change." Arthur spoke up. "I think that you are entirely right, Mr. Endy. I had not considered the possibility of not using the evidence furnished by Chambers, but would it not be well to invite true men to be with us?" "A capital idea," said Robert. Arndt said sadly, "Chandler, tell them why it would be of no use. I will see to sending the telegrams to King and Hartley at once," and he left the room. To say that Robert was astounded at what Chandler then told would not be adequate. He was dumbfounded. It was Arthur who first found words to express his scathing opinion of Martinvale's deliberately breaking his word and taking advantage of Mr. Endy's death to prevent Robert and those his father had represented from having any opportunity to reorganize the company.
When Robert did speak, his wrath was directed straight at the men who had once more sold their brethren into slavery and helped to rivet new chains on them. Of some of the members of the committee it could be said that what they had done was done in ignorance, but all men knew that Trueman and several of the more influential men on that committee had simply sacrificed their fellows in order to stamp out the socialism they hated so intensely. Even Robert in his most angry moment did not accuse Trueman of receiving a bribe in any shape or form, though he knew that Trueman or some of his friends or relatives would be well taken care of and provided for in the future. When he was somewhat relieved by the free expression of his opinions, he said, "I sincerely pity Arndt. This is, I know, the most severe blow he has ever received. He is as honest as the day is long, to use father's favorite expression, and he thought of but two objects, I verily believe, Nettie MacDonald and the Union. Of course, he is still in the Union, but how can he work there with any heart after such infamous treatment?" Then he turned to Chandler and said, "You are still counsel for the Union?" "No. I enlisted in the Socialist ranks this morning and resigned that office immediately after the committee slapped Arndt in the face. But I think that no one need envy Trueman and his followers. Just wait until the grievances, which are sure to come, pile up beyond endurance, and then the workers will realize that they dare not do a thing to shake off the burden. And it is my opinion that that will be the time to let them know that if those men had waited, the little space between the 24th of February and the 1st of March, every one of the concessions they have now secured, and more, would have been granted, and the whole management of the works reorganized, and then will be the day of retribution for Trueman." "I agree with you," said Robert, "but what I asked the question for was to know whether you were free to work for me as you had been for my father. If so, I desire that you continue right on. I hold the money, lands, and properties all in trust for a sacred cause, and so long as we are compelled to live under this accursed system, I desire that they shall all be as productive as possible. The cause is going to need every penny it can get, and judging by the action of the representatives of the workers this day, the only way to convince them of the iniquity of the system is to show them that they simply cannot continue under it and live. My father said that I was a hard man. He was right. I was hard in a devilish cause. I have heard it said that no lesson in life is needless or lost. From this day I shall, as far as possible, give the hardness that survives in me a chance to work. It shall operate to the giving an object lesson to the workers. I will be as tender as God himself to the workers who have the courage and manliness to stand up for their rights under the despised banner of socialism. But let the man, rich or poor, that comes under my power, and who believes that this earth was made for but the few, beware. I shall exact from him the law's utmost farthing." "I accept gladly," said Chandler. "I have a growing clientage and business is good, but some of it will, of course, fall off on account of today's action." Then they set the machine going and listened to the corroborating words that testified to the accuracy of the book. Meanwhile, Arndt, on going to the library to write the telegrams, found Nettie there reading. She arose to go when he entered, but he said, "Wait, dear, if you can. I would like to speak to you as soon as these telegrams are on their way. Or perhaps you had better bring Annie here, so that I can tell both of you at once." They were already seated when he returned from giving the messages to Rollins, and he then told them all about the day's doings, and he confessed that it was rather pleasant to be commiserated with, as they commiserated him, and when Annie saw that there was nothing more to tell, she said, "I am doubly thankful that you have a cause that will take all your thought and strength, and that will not leave you time to brood over this affair." And then she left the room. As soon as she was gone, Arndt said, "Little sweetheart,
I do not like to intrude on your sorrow at the loss of a dear friend just now, but you see that things are happening in spite of us, and that we cannot secure the breathing space we need. If you have no objection, I would like to hear of your plans for the immediate future, so that I can shape my actions accordingly. You see, I have told you everything, even my thoughts, just as in the olden days, and I lack but the same thing from you to make me forget even the disagreeables of today." She came to where he was sitting and placed her hand in his, and he arose and put his arm about her, and thus they walked up and down the long room as they talked, and then each knew that the days of partial estrangement were over. After a little while she said, "I think that we should be married soon. But first there must be the days of mourning for my father and my second father. Were it not for that, I am ready now. I am yours and you are mine, and I will tell you how I mean to employ those days, not in idly shedding tears, not in wearing black and sitting down with folded hands. Annie and I have planned it all. You see, she never has talked to me of socialism as she did to all the others. She knew that I had inherited all my father's hatred and distrust of anything that even hinted at the supplanting of the present system. And then also she knew that my tired brain demanded rest and quiet. During all these months I have heard not one word from her on the subject. Several times I overheard her arguing with Dr. Kennedy, and since we have been here with Mr. Endy, but never when I was in the room. So now you see, lover mine," and how his heart leaped to hear the old endearing term, "I joined the comrade army and gave my hand to the others on trust. What thing is good enough for such a man as my second father was, and what thing is good enough for such a man as my lover is good enough for me." "May I ever be worthy of your trust," said Arndt, as he stooped and kissed her, and then they resumed their walk. "But see," said Nettie, "there must be equality between us, else how can I uphold your hand and stay your heart? And if I do not know the reasons, and do not become acquainted with the work that is being done, and that is yet to do, how can I be to you what I have been in bygone days, or what I mean to be in days to come?" The first rays of the rising moon were shining in at the window, and they turned their steps that way and stood as they had walked, and then she said, "This is the plan. I am going to Clyde with Annie. We are going to have rooms in Mr. Hartley's house. The money we will be able to pay him will not come amiss to the family, Annie tells me, and I am going to study, and I am going to visit with her among the poor, and go to socialist lectures. And we will talk to Editor Hartley, and even help him whenever he will let us, and so the days will be very full of work and learning, and some day I shall, perhaps, take my pen in hand and write to one I know and say, 'Dear lover mine, your bride is ready now,' and don't you think that lover will be glad?" "I do not think, I know," said Arndt. And then they stood in silence for a little while, and gazed across the park towards the house on the river road, and the thoughts of each were there. Finally she said, "I will be pleased if you can make your plans so that no matter where we may have to go in the carrying on of your and my life work, we shall always keep the old homestead as home." And without waiting for him to reply, she kissed him and left the room. He heard her address Annie in the hall, and then they both said good night to him, and he lit a cigar and sat there in the moonlight until he heard the carriage arrive that had been sent to the depot for the expected guests. His message to King had been as explicit as he dared make it, but to Hartley he had said simply, "Put a bunch of membership blanks in your pocket and meet me at the Endy mansion at 8 tonight." He greeted both men cheerfully and cordially, and then Hartley, in a very subdued tone, said, "Where are we to go? Is the meeting going to be a big one? How many additions to the party do you think?" You are at your journey's end. Make yourself comfortable. I can't say that the number of editions will be large, but I think you will be satisfied," said Arndt. As soon as Kenedy arrived they assembled in the library, and Arndt brought in the little machine and placed it on the center table, and then explained matters in as few words as possible. Then Robert opened the book and told how he had received it, and said: "As a preface to the book, Chambers has a certificate from the University of Heidelberg stating that he had undergone a test extraordinary, at his own request, in the matter of the capability of the human memory, and that after once hearing he repeated 10 pages of a scientific work then in process of compilation, which he had never seen or heard before, and that he repeated the matter again at the expiration of 48 hours. It seems incredible, but there is the certificate. When we remember that he had this machine in mind, and that it was a part of a plan, I think we can understand why he wanted that test made and that certificate granted. Of course, in lengthy conversation, the little machine could not take down but a portion here and there, because he never knew when he might be able to replace the cylinder without fear of detection. And so he had it record the most vitally important parts, simply to corroborate his unimpeachable memory." Chandler said, "I've been listening to some of the revelations the machine has to make, and before Arndt puts on the first cylinder I will state that while examining that most wonderful piece of mechanism, I, without thought, turned it bottom upward and found its name on the silver plate fastened there." Arndt immediately tilted the machine and read, "The Recording Angel!" And then, without comment, he fixed a cylinder in place and touched the lever, and not a man of them said a word. After they had heard several portions read from the book, and thus substantiated by the machine, they put it to one side and one after another read aloud from the book. When midnight struck they were not half through, and Robert said, "Shall we retire, gentlemen?" King replied instantly, "I, for one, would like to finish it tonight. I am obliged to be in Clyde at the earliest possible moment tomorrow, or rather today, and we cannot do better than to hear all he has to tell us at once." All agreed to this, and the reading was resumed, and because they read steadily and without interruption, the last word had been heard and the book was closed at 2:30. Then Arndt stated that they wanted advice as to the disposition to be made of the book and the machine and the records. It was noteworthy that not one of them seemed to be in any doubt as to there being at least 2 sides to that question, and Hartley expressed the state of mind of most of them when, after a little hesitation, he said, "I will confess that if you had asked me that immediately after hearing the Johnson interview, I should have thought you were losing your minds. At first I was congratulating the Socialist cause with all my heart, but a thing of this kind can be too big. It is like the chemist and his combinations. He don't know what the next one may produce. Now, I, for one, think that, especially at this time when Truman has sold out the workers and Martinvale has most of them fooled, it would be the height of folly to publish the book, or even to let more than a trusted few know of its existence. I will say that I feel immeasurably stronger as a Socialist since hearing the machine talk. Always, there are many things that we editors know well enough, but would find it difficult to prove, and as things are now, we are compelled to simply hint at them or pass them by. Hereafter I shall not hint, and the mere fact that I speak boldly will cause our opponents to fear to call our hand. But let us let it rest at that until the dawning of the day that inaugurates the cooperative commonwealth. Then it may all be published, to be handed down as the only unimpeachable history ever known in this world. The people of this country lack education in the fundamental principles of socialism. We are working day and night to give it to them, and they are getting it,
and absorbing it about as fast as we could reasonably expect, for the mass of men are, and continually show themselves still to be, very like the cows and horses and hogs on my little farm, not content with plenty, but fighting to get more than plenty, for fear that they will not get enough. That is the direct result of capitalism, and I can blame no man for trying to ensure his own future and the future of his children in the old and only way possible under capitalism. But we must educate them to the better way, the way of equality. Now, the revelations of this book would divert their minds from that education, and it is fundamentally necessary to them and to the permanent success of our cause, and would, in all probability, when they realized that under the plans and purposes of the rich they were in the future to stand no show whatever to secure plenty for themselves or their children, stir them up to open revolt. This, of all things, the socialist dreads and deprecates. This will never be if he can prevent it. Those who refuse to distinguish between him and the anarchist are either ignorant fools or deliberate liars, or perhaps paid knaves. I run up against all three of them every day, and some days the latter are by far the most numerous." Robert said, "I would like to hear how it appears to you, Dr. King. You have not mixed in politics, and will be able to give us an unbiased opinion as a man of trained scientific mind and as a citizen." King replied promptly, "Perhaps I can best answer you by telling how the hearing of that mass of testimony affected me. You know that I have heretofore withstood all arguments presented by the Socialist, and simply because I believed that reform was still possible. Well, I am with the Socialists from this minute, heart and soul. So far so good. But I have always been a hearty and whole-souled peaceman, and yet I reached a stage while listening to that evidence where if the call to arms to resist such men as Craigie had been sounded in my ears, I would have enlisted on the spot. I still love and believe in peace, but there is not and cannot be peace where there is slavery. A man had better be dead than be a slave, or a slave driver. And I want to call your attention to the fact that I reached the fighting stage first. Now, I am rather cold-blooded, and if it affected me in that way, I ask you to consider what would be its effect on the inflammable mass that tolerates present conditions in the hope of a morrow that testimony shows it is the intention of the rich shall never dawn for the workers. I think Mr. Hartley's advice is admirable, and I hope that those to whom the care of the machine and book and papers have been entrusted will see their way clear to following it." Hartley caused a smile and a little amusement by shaking hands with King and immediately offering him a membership blank, saying, "I never miss a chance, Doctor. Carry them about with me day and night, but I had no idea that I was going to bag such big game tonight." And he then and there had each of the others sign and fill out his application, except Arndt, who had already attended to the matter when he consulted with Hartley about his future work. Before they retired for a few hours' rest, Chandler drew up a paper which he and Arndt afterwards executed, which assigned the machine and the book and papers to the cooperative commonwealth, and added the names of all those present as trustees and custodians of everything left by Chambers. The paper stipulated that the successor of each or any of them should be chosen by a majority vote of the others, but that a 3/4 vote should be required to authorize the publication of the book, or the taking of either the book or the recording angel out of the place determined on for their safe keeping, which, for the present, was to be in the box in the vault of the Deposit Building at Clyde, where it had so long rested in silence. After the others had gone to their rooms, Arndt said to Robert, "I suppose you are right.
In fact, I am convinced that you are, but it certainly does seem a great pity that the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, cannot be told at once. But I will confess that I have had qualms all along about using information, secured as this was. There is a quality of treachery about it that I find very unpalatable. It is true we are virtually in a state of war, and Chambers evidently thought so, and that war justified anything that would beat your enemy. Now we want to convert ours and bring them into our ranks, if it can be done, and the old method of education is the best." Robert heartily agreed, but ended by saying, "But if they bring about a state of actual war, I, for one, will certainly vote to use the weapon Chambers has placed in our hands. And by actual war, I mean carrying their tactics, as they have heretofore several times done, to the point of having workers shot down or imprisoned on hatched-up pretexts. Let me tell you, Charlie, your scruples are suited to the socialist state, but under capitalism you will find them unworkable. I agree that for the present the truth must be suppressed, but it is certainly hard on us and on the recording angel." "Yes," said Arndt solemnly, "if their plans for disfranchising the workers materialize, they must be convicted of this infamous conspiracy, and to do that the words of their own mouths must rise in condemnation against them. The recording angel must then, regardless of consequences, be given free course." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Recording Angel by Edwin Arnold Brenholtz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 24. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes, and then the new life morn. The next day Robert passed in almost unrelieved solitude, for Arndt had been compelled to go with Chandler to Clyde to attend to the disposition of the body of Chambers, which still lay at the morgue, and to distribute the money left in their care. When they came to that part of their duties, they recollected the widow of the operator killed by the sheriff, and although his name was not on the list furnished by Chambers, they immediately went to see the woman. They found that her husband had been buried on the preceding day, that she had spent almost her last dollar in funeral expenses, and that she had nothing to depend upon except her own labor to support herself and 3 children. It did not take them long to reach the decision which appropriated 1/3 of the money left by Chambers to her permanent relief. And when they had divided the remainder among the parties named on the list, and sent checks for the amounts to the recipients of his bounty, they drew a sigh of relief. "What an accursed system it is," said Chandler. "How it breeds vice and crime and hatred, revenge and remorse. Time and again I have been heartsick while prosecuting criminals in the courts, and often I have felt the utter futility of the whole procedure." Arndt made no reply, but after a few moments, and just before taking leave of his friend, he said, "I have a little, the bitterest thing of all, yet to do. The works start tomorrow, and I shall not be in them, and I find myself just about bankrupt. There is a little coming to me on my pay from Mr. Endy, but I cannot escape accepting Robert's proposition. He wants to go abroad at once and come in contact with the leaders of the socialist movement in foreign lands and study for, say, 6 months or so, and he insists that I shall go with him, saying that the money we will use belongs as much to me as to him, since it was left in trust for the cause, and I suppose that if we are to do effective work it would be a wise move. But you, who have known me all my life, can imagine how I feel about going on such terms. I am wild to be doing for the cause, not receiving from it." But Hartley says that Robert is right, that it will be best for the cause to have things quiet down for a while and let the workers find out for themselves just what Martinvale is going to do with and for them, and that both of us need rest and change and time to forget the bitterness which we are at present bound to feel. Well, certainly my own sense of my ignorance of how to go to work at this new business, and of what is best to do and not to do, is great enough, God knows. Still, of all the bitter things that ever I had to do, this is the bitterest." "What about Nettie?" his friend inquired. Then Arndt told him all and added, "So far as she is concerned, there would be little difference between my being across the Atlantic or being in Steelton, and in fact I could not make a living in Steelton today. I am blacklisted, you are aware. I shall feel easier about her and Annie, knowing that you and your good wife will do all you can for them while I am away. I shall give my pet to Nettie before I leave." And then he said goodbye and hastened to the station. On the train he saw Baker, and went over to where he was seated and exchanged seats with the gentleman beside him. As soon as Arndt was comfortably fixed, he said, "Well, did you and the others who stood by me yesterday obey orders and attend Mr. Craggie's funeral today?" "Not much we didn't," said Baker. "And I'll tell you that while there was a tremendous crowd, I didn't hear of any Socialists being there, and many a member of the Union at Clyde was absent. No, sir. There were telegrams or condolence sent to his relatives by every crowned head on the globe. We didn't send any. Instead, the 5 of us called a meeting and told all who attended just how you had been treated and how they had lost by calling the strike off at this time, and I think that the news is spreading rapidly. Now we want a copy of that plan of Mr. Endy's that Martinvale agreed to put in operation, and we are going to publish it." "I will have to consult Robert Endy about that," said Arndt, "for Mr. Endy himself at the last saw that it had not been accepted as he intended it, and that it would be used, like all similar plans, simply to defer the coming in of socialism. He died an avowed socialist, and his son stands pledged to use his wealth to further that cause." "That explains it," said Baker. "What?" "The order to start the mills tomorrow. The order that says that every man who does not report tomorrow morning will have to hunt another job. Now you see how it is. You must not blame the men. They will just simply have to be working at the hours set for the burial of the man who did more for them than any other mortal ever did." Arndt said sadly, "I shall not blame them. But after this I do not see how they can call themselves free. Martinvale owns them. What does a brass tag more or less matter to a man that dares not attend the funeral of his best friend? Martinvale could very well yield on that point." Baker hung his head in shame as he said, "About that best friend business, you know. Didn't Mr. Endy revoke that will and give everything to his son and refuse to aid the strikers further at the last? That's the song and dance that the Trueman clique are putting up for us now." Arndt said hotly, "That is another of those damnable half-truths that such men as Martinvale feed to the toilers by the hands of such traitors as Trueman, and which we, the workers, always swallow without chewing. Mr. Endy withdrew no support from the men, for he had had the assurance of Martinvale, which made the end of the strike no further off than the 1st of March, and he simply gave all instead of a part of his estate to the workers when he bequeathed it to Robert Endy with instructions to use it for socialism. I myself wrote Trueman about it and informed him fully of all the facts." I know, I understand," said Baker, "but you can see how it is that Trueman was able to muster such a crowd at Craggie's funeral today. They think that Mr. Endy deserted them and that Trueman and Martinvale are their saviors, and both of them ordered the men to turn out." Arndt smiled bitterly, and then Baker said,
And then, you know, there's always an unaccountable number who are glad for the chance at a free trip 10 miles up the river to a $20 million mausoleum. No matter whose funeral it is, and no matter who they honor by going, I prefer the blacklist." "Don't let it make you bitter against the boys," said Arndt. "Just remember that we have Socialism to thank for not being duped ourselves. Their time for seeing things straight is near at hand. Robert knows Martinvale well and has been telling me some things about him. What are you going to do for a living?" They were leaving the car when Arndt asked this question. "Faith, and I don't know," said Baker carelessly as he turned to go, "but I'm an able-bodied, skilled mechanic and willing to work, and even though the Union has shook me, I don't feel less competent to earn a living than heretofore, and I don't propose to starve in a land of plenty simply because others have my share of the universe locked up." "Go and see Hartley," said Arndt. "He has a new fund and will set you to work." Arndt found it rather a bitter thing to be compelled to inform his friend of what to expect, but he felt that it would be cruel not to do so. As it turned out, there was a much better and larger attendance than they had any reason to expect under the circumstances, for some of the men saw through things and asserted their manhood and defied the order, and Hartley brought all the Socialists he could muster in Clyde. After all was over, Hartley and his wife went back with the family party to the mansion, and that same afternoon Annie and Nettie accompanied them to their home in Clyde to begin their new life. Robert and Arndt delayed their departure until after the 1st of March. Robert had readily agreed to the publication of his father's plan in full, but he did not let Baker send any of the booklets out until the next day, that is, the 2nd. On the 1st, he attended the meeting of stockholders of the Iron and Steel Company and confronted Martinvale with it, and demanded to know whether he intended to keep the promise he had made to Robert Endy Sr. Martinvale replied sarcastically, "Do I intend to give away millions to the workers needlessly? The whole situation changed the instant Mr. Craggie died. My promises are always made conditionally." Robert had had a copy of the plan of reorganization handed to each person present, and he simply turned his back on Martinvale, who was presiding, and addressed them, saying, "Every gentleman that wishes to have as presiding officer of this corporation a man whose promises cannot be relied on, can secure such an officer by voting for the present incumbent. For myself, I prefer an honest man." There were a few who voted against Martinvale on account of the occurrence, but the vast majority, when they read of the generous provision for the welfare of the workers as set forth in the plan, simply censured him for having ever agreed to the proposal at all. Robert took great pleasure in voting every share of his own and all the proxies he had been able to secure against Martinvale. Not, however, with any hope of defeating him, but only as a moral protest against his acts and his treachery. After the meeting he told Chandler to not sell any stock or bonds of the company, since it was evident that the workers were going to be fleeced to the quick, and that the only way for them to ever get anything in return would be to read the socialist literature he had instructed Hartley to send out at his expense. On their return from that exciting meeting, both Robert and Arndt realized as they drew up before the door of the mansion how impossible it would have been for them to have continued to live there. The place seemed as silent and lifeless as the tomb. The faces of the servants were sad, and the whole atmosphere of the place was so depressing that Robert said, "Arndt, we must leave here by the 10 o'clock express. I simply cannot endure it." "There will be no difficulty about that," Arndt replied. "Everything has been arranged, and Rollins will be in charge and doesn't need many orders. Leaving now will give us more time for farewells in Clyde tomorrow, you know. That is the bright side of this cloud, comrade." It was then almost sunset, and by 8 o'clock they were out of the house and on their way to the graveyard.
They had left the mansion on foot, and not one word was spoken until they stood beside the mound of bare brown earth that covered the remains of Robert's father. Then Arndt said sadly, as he leaned against the rough-cut granite rock that bore the names of MacDonald and Endy, "The day when the working men of the world shall make pilgrimages to this spot is not yet, but so surely as there is justice in the heavens that day will come, and may I be alive to see it." Then Robert stepped to his side and said, "When will the workers learn to know and stand by their friends? That is the most discouraging thing about it all. Now I should say nothing, for I was doing my best to bind their chains the tighter on them, but that they should turn against you, who—" But Arndt stopped him. "It was only a few of the leaders. The rank and file never did, or at least could not help themselves. It seems that there are certain lessons that the race must be taught, and they can be taught and learned in but one way. I was one of the men that consented to place almost dictatorial power in the hands of a few. I thought it was necessary in order to checkmate Craggie. I am not going to cry out. I am reaping what I sowed. It is bitter, certainly, but there are compensations even in this. It is worth a great deal to a man who has been almost totally blind to see clearly. I never before understood why all the efforts of the workers to emancipate themselves or even to better their condition resulted in failure. Now I see clearly that each and every such movement had in itself the seed of death and dissolution. Nettie was emphatically right. Any movement that seeks to better the condition of but a class is doomed. In its very essence it is selfish as the rich. The wage worker who wishes to thrive at the expense of the farmer is just as bad as his employer. The socialist whose socialism is not broad enough to take in all workers in all lands, whether they work with the hand or the brain, has his socialism still to learn. His kind will never succeed, nor indeed should it. The world is big enough for all, and there is happiness enough in the universe to go around. The union is all right in its place, and I shall remain an active worker in the union till I die, but its place is as an equal part in an organic whole that must be as wide as the world and as broad as the human race, and that the union itself can never be. I will never again work for anything less than that. It took my recent bitter experience to teach me this. You can't have anything but men as narrow as true man as leaders in a narrow movement. It is folly to expect it. If broad-minded men stay in the movement, they are sure to advocate something beyond it. Again, I was one of those men who made the mistake of advising our men to submit to the law which compelled them to undergo military training, and as a logical consequence of that error, we told them to shoot in order to protect property. Now the man or cause that values human life less than property deserves to fail. I was a slave to the middle class, neither more nor less." Then they left the graveyard, and Robert did not reply until they were well on their way to the depot, when he said, "I had not reasoned that out, but I feel that your conclusion is correct. As Lowell said, 'How can any man be truly free while there is a single slave on the face of the earth?'" "That needs no answer," said Arndt. And then there was silence between them until they came to that spot in the road from which the last view of the twinkling lights of the mansion could be had, and they instinctively turned and glanced that way. Then Robert asked Arndt, "Charlie, what shall I do with that? It isn't right to have it standing idle in a world where so many are homeless. That beautiful old house and grounds must be doing somebody some good." His friend replied promptly, "You have taken my words out of my mouth. How would it do to have Chandler make all the preparations quietly, and get the names of a lot of socialist orphans who need a home, and then, when all is ready, tell Annie and Nettie about it as a surprise.
I think that Annie would easily imagine herself in heaven if she were daily training a bunch of little fellows in socialism, and at the same time giving them a foretaste of what the cooperative commonwealth will one day do for all children. And Nettie would be delighted to aid personally and financially, I know." "You've struck it exactly," said Robert enthusiastically. "I will support it out of my private means if others do not care to assist. Why didn't I think of it? I will tell Chandler to give the preference to the children of those men whose work for the cause has kept them poor. It is the very thing. We will attend to it tomorrow." Arndt was rejoiced to see how cheerful Robert had become, and he did not interrupt his happy thoughts with useless words. A short distance further on they passed the house that Cassidy called home. March had come in like a lamb, and the window opening on to the street was raised. As they involuntarily paused, the voice of Cassidy was heard addressing his children. "Now then, youngsters, just one more song this night. What shall it be?" "Toilers arise! Toilers arise!" was the instant and unanimous decision. Robert and Arndt stood there in the dark and listened to that best and noblest song and battle call of labor until the last word and note had died away, and as they started again towards their destination, Arndt said, "Would to God that the poet's vision were true this moment, and that the long, long night were over. Carpenter, one of the world's great poets, a socialist, wrote it, you know." Robert said candidly, "No, I did not know. Poetry and song have been strangers to me since the day I threw the rein on the neck of soul-destroying ambition. That is the first time I ever heard it, and I shall never forget that time. It is truly a noble, soul-stirring song. I believe that if we could get them all singing it with the understanding as well as with the voice, we might bring in that brighter day, and soon. You are right, Arndt, you are right. We sing too little. The only chance to forget the past and escape the ghosts that haunt its memories is to sing." Arndt knew well to what particular ghost Robert referred. He had hesitated to speak to him on the subject. Now he replied emphatically, "There are some ghosts that can't be laid. I would at once call Arthur off that case, and let the ghost reappear or not, as the future may determine. From what we know of Chambers, we may readily conclude that he stopped at nothing to make certain of success. He was desperate, for he realized that his time was short and that the thing he had set out to do was still uncertain of accomplishment." Robert did not reply until they had arrived at the station and secured their tickets and were pacing arm in arm up and down the platform, waiting for the fast approaching train that was to bear them away for so long a time from the dear and familiar scenes. And then he said, "Again you are right. That is the proper course to pursue." "I'm glad that you agree with me," said Arndt heartily. "It is dust to dust, ashes to ashes. Let the dead past bury its dead. We face the untried future. It belongs to love, to friendship, and to the comrade cause. Can it be wholly dark?" And without waiting for any reply, he, in the same low-voiced and sympathetic tone that Nettie had listened to on that night she never will forget, said, "Aye, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, and from dust and ashes, this. And from out the lives of the countless slaves that have toiled and prayed and died, and from out their dust deep, deep in graves and on summits for which they tried, and from out their ashes that then held fire, and from out their breath of prayer, on the morrow shall bloom your heart's desire with its roots in the ashes there. Oh, the ashes and dust! Oh, the ashes and dust! And the blood and the tears it takes! But the blooms and the leaves and the stems say must, and the fruit full repayment makes. And the morrow shall dawn, perchance next morn, when the fruit shall be plainly seen. O heart's desire that is never a thorn for the hand of a child to glean." The end. End of chapter 24. End of The Recording Angel by Edwin Arnold Brenholtz.